Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome back to another episode of our close readings of Kōhei Saitō's Slow Down. Last week we started reading the 7th chapter, Degrowth Communism Will Save the World, and today we continue that chapter. So this chapter is about how to bring degrowth communism, how to make the transition from capitalism to degrowth communism, and we stress that what we need to do is the decommodification of social relations. We need to make relations based on on mutual aid instead of commodity exchange. And so this means that we need to revolutionize our way to organize social relations, meaning that we need to revolutionize labor. Revolution begins in the site of production and labor, not of circulation. That was the big take from last week's episode. But we didn't really say how that revolution is supposed to look like, or what it is supposed to look like, or as Saito asks, so what exactly should we be doing? So last thing we addressed was the barriers that prevent us from considering that revolution in the site of production, and the fact that we think that there is no alternative to capitalism, for example, that undermines our imagination, and that's why we are always we're kind of content with solutions only on the political level, the sphere of circulation. But as we widen our imagination, we start conceiving of alternatives. We've seen instances of such alternatives in the case of the Tooting bus turning circle and the urban farming initiatives in Detroit and Copenhagen. So these represent a break from politicalism, the belief that solutions to social and environmental issues can only come from politicians and elite experts. So revolutionizing social relations and the site of production needs that people become more powerful, that they gain more agency, that they should have more power than politicians and experts in political decision making, just like in cooperatives, for example, where workers have the power to take decisions on production rather than, leaving it to capitalist owners or board of directors or shareholders. So we started sketching what this revolution will look like, but we need more than just that. We need concrete pillars and concrete measures, and this is what the second part of the chapter is about, like what to do exactly. Now, the main focus of degrowth communism is ecology, right? Whatever the revolution, will be, it has to be an ecological revolution, otherwise no emancipation is possible. So the revolution in social relations and in the site of production must have one fundamental goal in mind, which is to heal the metabolic rift between humanity and nature. That was the point of Marx's Das Kapital. If we need to radically revolutionize labor, that's for the purpose that production can be conducted in sync with nature once again. So the climate crisis is precisely the biggest consequence of our capitalist labor, so the only way out of the crisis is by crucially changing the nature of labor itself. As we explained many times already, labor is what connects humans to nature. It's what mediates the relationship between humans and nature. So the metabolic rift and its healing depend on the nature of that labor between humans and nature. So Das Kapital offers us a great explanation of how, our current modes of labor and production under capitalism destroy the planet, how they cause a metabolic rift. But Das Kapital doesn't explain exactly how changes in production and labor would actually help solve climate change. In other words, like Saito says, what we need, besides knowing how capitalism causes climate change and the metabolic rifts, we also need to know how labor conducted under communism would help heal the irreparable rift in the metabolism connecting humanity to nature. And so this lack of explanation for a healing of the rift is what brought barrages of criticisms towards Marx by ecologists, which we already saw, and we saw those criticisms. If Marx didn't provide ways to heal the rift, then we can say that, that the criticism is, deserving, and it is earned. And the only thing left is, kind of a pessimism, like a sense that there is nothing that we can do about it. The only solution then is to fall back on productivism, like we keep unleashing the productive forces until hopefully one day the proletariat will take over production before the whole earth breaks down, and with new technologies developed by the proletariat under communism, the rift will heal itself. So in other words, stopping at Das Kapital simply forces us into, admitting natural limits, but those limits, I mean the narrative, the productivist narratives that is still found in Das Kapital, it says that it's a good thing that it recognizes natural limits, but also it kind of implies that those limits will be overcome once locking technologies and unlimited productivity are organized through communism. And so this, of course, is wishful thinking, and it deserves criticism and skepticism. But this is only valid if Marx really stopped his thought at Das Kapital. But thankfully he didn't, and as we said, Marx's late writings, after Capital Volume 1, they did provide a sketch for how to heal the rift. Well, I say a sketch because Marx died before he could finish Volume 2 and 3, in which he was going to integrate his new findings. He studied avidly the natural sciences precisely because he was trying to find the way to heal the rift. So as Saito says, Marx never theorized degrowth communism, but when we take Marx's later perspective into account, when we look at his notebooks about the natural sciences and then reread Das Kapital with that research in mind, we can guess that we can guess what was the way that Marx was heading towards, and so the way of healing the rift would have looked like, degrowth communism had Marx, finished Volume 2 and 3. Like what Saito says, that even though Marx never theorized degrowth communism, when we look at what he was studying at the end of his life, well, you guess that if he lived to finish Volume 2 and 3, well, he would have had theorized degrowth communism. So according to Saito, with the elements that we have from Marx's late writings, we can deduce that at the end he will find degrowth communism at the end of Marx's thought, and how it would be able to repair the metabolic rift. So in other words, Saito is basically claiming that he is finishing Das Kapital, or let's say more humbly, that he's updating it for the Anthropocene. Whereas 20th century Marxists, they kind of stopped at Das Kapital, and so they overlooked for 150 years the post-capital works of Marx, and hence, they got trapped into this wishful thinking. In reality, natural limits won't be overcome once workers, just begin to use technology and science on their own behalf. You cannot heal the rift with the same technologies or productive principles, let's say, that caused it. So Saito says that's the kind of productivist thinking that gave rise to unholy creations, like for example the chimera, like Bastani's luxury communism, which is a blend of Marxism with Silicon Valley capitalism. We already covered that in chapter 5 on accelerationism. So now when we read Das Kapital, it has to be read as leading to degrowth communism, meaning that it has to be read with the implications of his late-in-life study of ecology and communal social forms. So this means that when we read it now, it cannot be through the lens of the progressive view of history or productivism. We explain, what that is in chapter 4, Marx in the Anthropocene, when we reviewed how Marx changed his own views regarding communism. So before Capital, communism was essentially Eurocentric and productivist, but after Capital it was neither. So this new version of communism that Marx was trying to develop at the end of his life is degrowth communism. So that's a summary of everything so far regarding Marx's thought. Now it's time we explore how exactly to bring out degrowth communism. So let's start with what Saito calls the 5 pillars of degrowth communism. The true form of Marx's thought can be organized into 5 main points. These points are: first, the transition to an economy based on use value; second, the shortening of work hours; 3, the abolition of the uniform division of labor; 4, the democratization of the production process; and finally 5, the prioritization of essential work. So these are demands that, if they are granted, then we have degrowth communism. So these are the 5 demands: transitioning to an economy based on use value, shorter work hours, no uniform division of labor, democratization of production process, and priority to essential work. So you have these 5 demands, you have degrowth communism. Now Saito expresses a criticism here, which is that these demands aren't very different from traditional Marxism. Like, where's the difference between degrowth communism and traditional Marxism if it is limited to only these 5 demands? Like, where's the degrowth and the ecology in these 5 pillars? Saito responds that these demands are actually very different from traditional Marxism because the ultimate goal of degrowth communism is very different from traditional Marxism. Traditional Marxism's goal isn't a sustainable economy but unlimited growth. It aims at accelerating growth. By contrast, degrowth communism's ultimate goal is to slow down economic growth because that's the only way to get to a sustainable economy, one that allows for human beings to flourish and lead fulfilling lives, and at the same time it doesn't destroy the environment on which those lives depend. So its goal is to decelerate. Once you have this goal in mind, those demands, those 5 pillars, will be very different from traditional Marxism because we also have to show how these demands will lead to deceleration, contrary to traditional Marxists who suppose that those demands will, actually lead to acceleration. They suppose that they support, those demands because they believe that they will, accelerate the economy even more, unleashing more productive forces, and so, get us closer to communism. So given these differences in goals, these demands will take radically different forms. And this is also the only way out of capitalism. Like Marx realized at the end of his life, demands that aim at economic growth can never transcend capitalism, but will forever stay trapped in capitalism and serve capitalism. So even if traditional Marxists aim at transcending capitalism to bring communism, if their ultimate goal is even more growth, they will never break from capitalism. Because as Saito says, capitalism has only one true enemy: deceleration. Deceleration is the natural enemy of capitalism, which can only function by accelerating. It's impossible to sync production to the cycles of nature under a capitalist system that constantly demands unlimited profit. This is why the only and truly revolutionary movement isn't acceleration, it is deceleration. Now let's look at what we can do to bring about degrowth communism at last. Alright, so let's start with the first pillar, transitioning to a use-value-based economy. So like we said, that pillar is also promoted by traditional Marxists. Transitioning to productivist communism is also a transition to a use-value-based economy, meaning a transition to an economy that prioritizes use value by putting an end to mass production and consumption. So both traditional or productivist communism and degrowth communism, they kind of agree upon this. We've already explained what is this distinction that Marx makes between use value, the utility, the quality, the impact on the environment of a product, and value as such, or exchange value, which is the value of a commodity. Exchange value means a product that has value only insofar as it is exchanged, meaning sold. As long as it can be exchanged with money, then it has value. In this sense, it is more accurate to call it a commodity rather than a product. A commodity has value only if it is sold, but the criteria for it to be sold has nothing to do with its use value. None of its utility, quality, or impact on the environment matters. And it doesn't even matter if it is discarded after it was bought. The only thing that matters is whether it is exchangeable with money. Capitalism prioritizes this kind of value, the kind that makes commodities, and it is constantly seeking to increase it. Anything that has value means that it sells. The greater the value, the greater its price, so more money. But once increase of value becomes the driving force of production, then we run into a myriad of contradictions. We've seen that what makes prices go up is the scarcity of a commodity while the demand for it is high. So for a capitalist to sell his commodity at high prices, he must provide a supply of it that is smaller than the demand for it, meaning that he must stimulate demand. But for a demand to be stimulated, the possibility for many people to buy that commodity must also exist, otherwise they won't buy it, right? So this can be done in two ways. First, you lower the price of the commodity and thereby it becomes cheaper. Since it is cheaper, people will want more of it, but once it is cheaper, it means that you can produce more of it. And that way, by selling many cheap commodities, you will make more money, more profits than by selling a few expensive commodities, since it is easier to stimulate the demand for cheap commodities than for expensive commodities. But in order for you to make those profits by lowering the prices and to meet the growing demand, the amount of production required for it is so huge that you end up destroying the resources that you rely on to produce, meaning the environment. In other words, a high demand makes prices low, which then allows you to produce in great quantity to satisfy that demand and make profit, but that mass production destroys the environment. The second way is you don't lower the prices, but keep increasing the prices, as long as the demand goes up, but this means that the commodity is getting scarcer. We've seen this with, for example, real estate speculation, how housing prices keep going up and fewer people can afford to buy homes. And so the supply is so small compared to the demand, but then people must be able to make more money in order to buy those scarce commodities that they want. But to be able to get enough money to buy that scarce commodity, it means that people must work more and therefore produce more. So you have a case where the increase of value occurs on the overall production of a commodity, since the unit price of the commodity goes down, and another case in which the increase of value occurs in the commodity itself because its unit price goes up. In both cases, this increase of value leads to overproduction, to more than what the environment can support or endure. And so this overproduction is also the result of an increase of productivity. For capitalism to rise value, it needs to increase productivity. Always to increase value are actually ways to just increase productivity. But this increase means that productivity becomes limitless. We must produce, we must work, we must constantly remain active. But since our activity occurs on a planet, using the resources of that planet, we must also give time for the planet to recharge, otherwise there won't be enough resources to sustain our activities. But the imperative of capitalism to increase value at all costs cannot afford to wait for nature to recharge, and therefore it destroys it in the process. So this is the analysis that is missing from productivist communism, its impact on natural resources. Productivist communists, they focus on use value only in the social aspect, and they discard this ecological aspect. Saito says this. He says, increased productivity naturally leads to more things being produced, but capitalism's fixation on a commodity's value over its use value gives rise to a system under which products are created primarily based on whether they sell rather than their utility for social reproduction. Indeed, the things truly necessary for social reproduction end up devalued. So what is bothering the productivist communists isn't, that we are producing more, but that we are producing according to value instead of use value. It wouldn't be a problem for them if everything we produce had a utility for social reproduction, but a utility for social reproduction doesn't mean utility for metabolic reproduction between humans and nature. Traditional Marxists would be fine with overproduction and increasing productivity as long as most things produced this way are necessary for social reproduction. But this is kind of a contradiction. You cannot have an economic system based on use value while you produce this much, even if everything that you produce is somehow necessary or useful. For such levels of productivity, it is impossible for the production that corresponds to it to be based on use value. So discarding natural limits or planetary ceilings can never make sense in an economy that claims to put the needs of society over the GDP. So while traditional Marxists would agree that it is unacceptable that we prioritize commodity value over use value, without limits in your relation to the natural world, this kind of communism is bound to fail. So yes, they will condemn, for example, productivist communists, they will condemn how the COVID pandemic was handled, for example. They will see that and say that capitalism has made the whole world lose all kinds of resilience in the face of the crisis, that capitalism has rendered all people helpless when disaster strikes. They will expose the way the production of necessary items to treat and prevent the spread of diseases, like the ventilators, the masks, the hand sanitizers, they prove to be woefully insufficient because the factories making such items have been moved overseas as a cost-cutting measure. They will lash out at how, because of this profit-seeking and cost-cutting measures, neither the supposedly developed countries nor the third world countries in which they moved their factories were able to produce enough masks for their citizens. They will expose this as a clear result of sacrificing use value in the name of capital, increasing its own value. but all they do is just try to put use value everywhere. They try to produce use value without limits, a limitless and infinite production of use value, but that doesn't make sense. As Saito says, use value is supposed to turn the priority to things like so many vital issues to be addressed, like guaranteeing universal access to food, water, electricity, shelter and transportation, combating rising tides and flooding, protecting ecology, and so on. We must prioritize the production of things necessary to respond to the crisis, not things whose worth resides only in their capacity to produce value. So we can say that both forms of communisms, like degrowth communism and productivist communism, they agree that this is incompatible with a production focusing on status symbols and luxury goods, on advertising and branding. Such production is why we are not resilient and why so many lives were lost during the pandemic. As Saito says, ignoring use value spells death in an age of climate crisis. But productivist communism, in the vital issues like that Saito just mentioned, they only focus on, for example, guaranteeing universal access to food, water, electricity, shelter, and transportation. They can also, focus on combating rising tides and flooding, but they tend to discard or downplay the importance of protecting ecology. The inconsistency lies in this, like without a protection of ecology, meaning without maintaining a metabolic interaction with nature that respects her cycles, all the other vital issues will be vulnerable. There won't be a way to guarantee universal access to those goods or to efficiently combat extreme weather phenomena or catastrophes, and many would still lose their lives in the process, losses that could have been avoided if we respected planetary ceilings. So for a real communism, even though I don't like the term real, but okay, so for a real communism, let's just roll with it. So a communism that makes sense, one that really wants to put use value above commodity value, one that wants to introduce a major shift in the purpose of production, then it is a communism that must be ecological at heart. And that only a decelerating communism can achieve that. Only by decelerating economic activity can communism be coherent and make sense. So once we accept that use value is intrinsically predicated on sustainability, on respecting nature's cycles, can we then say that use value is what is useful for society, what puts our needs as human social beings above the GDP and, of course, capitalism? So Saito says, production would no longer be organized around creating value, but rather around producing use value as determined through social planning. Put a different way, fulfilling people's basic needs would be prioritized over increasing the GDP. This is the grounding principle of degrowth. Marx would clearly be appalled at our current consumerism, whereby productivity rises and rises to fulfill even people's most fleeting desires endlessly. We must break ourselves out of our addiction to our present consumption practices and shift the emphasis of production to those things necessary for us to thrive while also practicing self-restraint. This is the form of communism necessitated by the Anthropocene. So we need a communism that practices self-restraint. So yes, producing use value, but use value can only be produced if we accept that nature imposes on us limits, and we must respect those limits and acts of self-restraint. Okay, this brings us to the second pillar of degrowth communism, shortening work hours. So the second pillar of degrowth communism is shortening work hours. Obviously, if we want to decelerate production, then we have to make work days shorter. But this isn't just out of necessity for the earth, but also for ourselves. Shortening work hours will also improve the quality of our lives. Now, this is related to the first pillar, to transitioning to use value-based economy. When you have an economy that is based on commodity value, you will spend a lot of time working to produce things that are not necessary, that their only purpose is to increase value. It's not to make your life better or anything like that, or making the life of others better. Work with that purpose is called meaningless work, because not only it doesn't contribute to any benefits for social reproduction, by which we don't mean, reproduction of social hierarchies, but of that what is beneficial for society. As a matter of fact, meaningless work contributes to the reproduction of social hierarchies. But on top of that, it also contributes to climate change. If you have an activity that not only makes your life miserable socially, but also reinforces that misery by also destroying the material world that you need for a good life, then that activity is meaningless, and a huge amount of our time is then wasted on meaningless work. So if you transition to use value, that meaningless work performed just to make money will eventually decrease dramatically. Now, productivity will focus on use value, meaning that it will be consciously redistributed to focus on producing only those things truly necessary for the reproduction of society. We won't need work like marketing, advertising, or packaging, which, if you remember in our episode on Chapter 6 on abundance in communism, we've already established how deadly these activities are for the environment and how they are the very pillar of commodity value. We explained that the purpose of these activities is precisely to stimulate that demand so that people keep consuming, to keep creating, in people needs for things that they don't need, so that production levels don't go down. Saito even says that these activities will be banned, like Plato banning poets from his Republic. And Saito also includes work and activities like consultancy and investment banking, same-day delivery and overnight shipping, along with convenience stores and family restaurants to be open all night, for example. So these would no longer be necessary and would disappear once we move to use value, and therefore we'll have less work hours and more free time. There are so many activities that we won't have to do anymore, since the only reason why we accept to do them is just to get enough money to merely get by, in which we produce even more useless stuff. So less working hours means less things produced, but if we accept that we don't want to produce so much useless shit, then work days will be shorter. Once we stop producing so many things that we don't need, we can reduce the hours people work across society as a whole. The reduction of meaningless labor that would result from shortening work hours would foster true prosperity. The shortening of work hours should also have positive effects on both people's lifestyles and the environment. Marx in Capital asserts that shortening work hours is a fundamental condition for transitioning to an economy based on use value. Today's society has surely attained a sufficient level of productivity already. Automation has enabled the unprecedented expansion of our productive power. At this point, there is really no reason why people shouldn't have already been liberated from wage slavery. All right, so we have already talked about Marx's chapter in Capital Volume 1 on the workday. So already in 1867, Marx was aware that much of production wasn't really based on use value, and therefore he advocated for shorter work days. Marx aimed at the 8 hours workday, but since we are updating Das Kapital to today's crisis, well, we can say that 8 hours workday, that's still not enough to reach, an economy based on use value. You need to reduce even more the work days to keep production and productivity at a sustainable level, which is possible, especially with the technology at our disposal. Because even if you take the productivist communism's view on this, if you just take the necessity of reducing work hours without regards to sustainability, there's no reason to make people work for as long as they do right now. There is no reason to keep wage slavery. Wage slavery in Marxism is the idea that the relation between an employer and an employee is still structured on that of a master and a slave. And the fact that the worker receives a wage is just to hide this hierarchy between them, to present them as two free individuals entering a free contract where one simply sells his labor force to the other. But in reality, since the worker needs that money to survive, he is compelled into this contract, which gives him, way more advantages to the employer than the employee. So the worker finds himself having to basically obey every whim of his boss because he needs that wage. And so this relationship is a disaster for both people and the environment. And here's why. Suppose, for example, you have a piece of land, okay? And on that land, you have 10 people who work on that land, and with their labor, they produce 100 apples, which is exactly what they need, okay? But they must work an entire day for the land to produce that much. Suppose now someone comes along and buys that land and he introduces a machine. Now that machine can produce 300 apples in just half a day and only needs 2 people to run it. So the boss makes just 2 dudes run the machine and he gets 300 apples and he gives a wage to these 2 to buy the apples that they need. But what about the 8 others? Well, common sense will say that with this new machine, why not just take turn to run the machine and distribute the 300 apples on everyone? But the capitalist owner is like, no, you have to buy those apples. But if you have a wage system, you cannot make 10 people run the machine because, well, their work hours will be too short, meaning that their wage will be so low that they cannot buy the apples. So the 8 other people are forced to find a job to consume apples that apples that are already produced. And so this means that these people will need to work in order to produce something that they don't need just to get what they need, which was already produced and, waiting to be exchanged for money. So since we established that the boss wants to increase his profits, it means not only that he must compete with other owners, so the price will fluctuate, which means that workers need to work even more to make more money to meet the market demands. And let's not also forget that the owner makes 300 apples if the machine is run only half a day. So why not make the machine run the whole day and get to 600 apples? And then also get the 8 other people to work in advertising and marketing to get them to buy more apples, more than what they actually need. So just with this thought experiment, we've shown the absurdity of capitalism just in the traditional Marxist critique. We haven't even spoken of the impact on the environment, but only of the absurd life of the workers in this scenario. With machinery, they can not only work half a day and everyone, can work just 1 day per week. If they just, take turns on running the machine, we said that only 2 people are needed to run it, then each one only works 1 day a week and only half a day when, previously they all needed to work on the whole day, on the land during a whole day just to make 100 apples. By just distributing the apples, everyone will be free and they can spend, the rest of their time doing other things now that the basic necessities of life are guaranteed. But this means that the relationship between people and machinery is not antagonistic. But how can it not be if we depend on wages? If we depend on wages for survival, then we are also competing with machines. Okay, the relationship between men and machinery in a wage system is antagonistic. For someone who doesn't want to lose his job, his only way to secure it is to make himself more indispensable than a machine, meaning that he has to be more productive than a machine somehow. He has to be something that never stops working, that doesn't get tired, that doesn't require sleeping, that doesn't have a social life, etc. A machine too needs rest, otherwise it overheats, but its rest is subsumed to its function, meaning that the only reason why it is allowed to rest is so that it doesn't break, so that it keeps carrying its function. In this perspective, rest is also part of work. It's also taken into account for productivity purposes, and as such it needs to be regulated so that it doesn't reduce the productivity of the machine beyond necessity. The same is also applied to humans. Resting, sleeping, eating, socializing, all of it is seen as breaks from work, as recharging the batteries, just to go back to work. And as such, their time is regulated and calculated on work. You only get enough free time to recharge. You only get what is enough so you can go back at running the machine. But this regulation changes according to the market. If the market requires more working time to increase value, it will devour that scarce time of recharging, and you won't be able to do anything against it because you need that wage. You cannot afford to let the machine run on itself, right? Otherwise, why does the boss keep you around? Sure, you can rely on the state to force the boss to keep you out of, pity, but even the state will eventually lean towards the boss once the GDP is not growing fast enough. So that's why we have to work long hours. And automation and machinery, instead of liberating us from this, they become a threat to take away from us our only chance at getting those apples. So, Saito says, under capitalism, though, automation means not the liberation from labor, but the threat of replacement by robots, the threat of unemployment. Haunted by the specter of losing our jobs, we work ourselves to the point of death. Here we see the irrationality at the heart of capitalism. We must free ourselves of this irrationality as quickly as possible. So here's the irrationality of capitalism. It makes us, suffer and undergo so much stress and anxiety, having to compete not just against one another, but even against machines, having to sacrifice quality time we could spend with our family, friends, learning new skills, making art, exercising, traveling when it's not, necessary. We are going, through unnecessary pain, making our lives miserable just so our labor and precious time increases value. So much stress and so many households struggle on a daily basis to juggle, childcare and caregiving, for example, meaning that we always have to choose between spending time with our kids or providing for our kids. In communism, however, even in productivist communism, we don't have to make these choices. We can, provide for and spend time with our kids because work would be shared. Providing for our kids and for ourselves would no longer require whole days of work. So, even when in productivist communism, there is no need for long hours, theoretically, because we will see that's not really the case, but theoretically there won't be need for long work hours, then there is no reason at all to force us into working this long. We can simply share work and plan production as a community according to our needs. And once we have enough, there is no need to keep working for the necessities of life. This means that the quality of our lives will go up, but that quality rise cannot be expressed in the GDP. Hence, if we have to evaluate or have a metric for how well a society is doing, clearly the GDP, value as such, isn't a good indicator. Now, in note 154, Saito insists that work sharing, like I said earlier, would reduce wages, and therefore even people working will be opposed to it. To share work means working less, so my wages will go down since I will also have to share my wages too. So what we need to understand is that sharing work is not a solution to unemployment, all right? Unemployment makes work necessary by default, whereas what we want is to make necessary work necessary only. There are jobs that must be performed if society wants to stay alive. So of course there's going to be some sort of coercion to make sure that we do it, some necessity to do them. So work sharing isn't a way to say that everyone must work as if unemployment is bad or that people must have wages. You haven't solved anything by doing that, because automatically, if this is just a solution to unemployment, like sharing work is just a solution to unemployment, you gave everyone a job, but the wages will go down too, which means that you just force people into poverty since they still require wages to survive. So the point of sharing work is that since it is necessary work that we need here, its purpose is just to avoid having to make some people do more of what is necessary than others. That time spent doing necessary work can also be time that I'd rather spend doing something else, but since it is necessary work, well, I have to do it. And so it wouldn't feel fair that someone else didn't do his time and spend it doing what he liked, while I not only didn't do what I liked on my time, but now I also have to cover for his time. So it's not about ending unemployment, and it isn't about receiving wages. In communism, even in the productivist type, there won't be wages anymore because they're obsolete. We produce enough for everyone and then we distribute it. No need to go through money to acquire what we all produced equally. Although in note 154, Saito claims that work sharing needs to be accompanied with raises in wages, but that wouldn't make sense, honestly, unless you are talking about a transition phase towards communism. But even transitioning, if it is still every transition, if it still relies on wages, it will require the intervention of a strong government, which means that there can be a risk there at escalating into climate Maoism. So I'm not sure what Saito thinks here, and so I don't assume that he doesn't know that in communism there is no such thing as money anymore, or that he thinks that we can still have wages in communism, but he doesn't explain how or why. So I don't know, so I just move on. And so about unemployment, it will no longer exist anymore, since no one has to be employed in order to survive or have access to anything or enjoy, a good life. So work sharing is about having agency in the work process, but we will go back to that in the fourth pillar. But we cannot stop here with the second pillar. We need to bring in degrowth communism now. While the productivist type argues for short work days, it doesn't argue for a decrease of productivity, and there lies its flaw. To go back to our thought experiment with the land and apples and the machine, productivist communism will argue for work sharing, but also for the machine to keep running all day long. We said that 2 people can make it work half a day, right? Well, that means that 4 people can run the machine for a whole day. Now, sure, this means that you will have longer work days than in degrowth communism, but you'll have to work, 2 days a week at best. Weekends are obviously days off in this experiment, but each day you just, work half a day, and then someone else comes in and works the second half. So we can say that you just work 1 day per week, which is still, a huge upgrade from the capitalist alternative. Plus, productivist communism also argues that if we raise productivity soon enough, we'll have another machine that doesn't overheat, and so we can just go back to just 2 people operating it for just half a day, but the machine keeps running on its own after that. It just needs maintenance for half a day only. And if we keep this up, maybe we will get to a machine that doesn't need any maintenance and simply runs by itself. We'll then, get thousands of apples a day without having to do any necessary work, and thus, any kind of work, any kind of labor or activity will be totally free. So in this model, shortening work hours is a way to raise productivity. Sure, workers are liberated from wages, but if this has destructive consequences on the environment, this liberation is as illusory than freedom under capitalism. And the problem is that this is the case with productivist communism. What we just described with our thought experiment is the kind of communism that is championed by Bastani and accelerationists. It's not degrowth at all. At best, it is degrowth capitalism again. Saito says that expressions like, for example, liberation from work and the 15-hour work week are catchphrases of such movements. But these movements don't understand the point of work because they leave it all, or at least necessary work, up to machines. In other words, labor becomes the mediation between not humans and nature, but between machines and nature. Humans just live on the other side of this. They just, rip off what machines have produced. And this is just another alienation from nature. Perhaps alienation in its ultimate form. We already explained the kind of political organization required to sustain this technology that does, the work for us. Such a technology cannot be that of a democracy. That again, fourth pillar, we will discuss that again. So we got to a point where humans are now alienated from nature, and thereby they are alienated from labor, which is what makes us human, remember. And we lose all agency in political matters regarding even how to control this technology. And cherry on the top, such a technology is more than likely to screw with nature's cycles and further destruction of the planet. So if the prospect of a fully automated economy sounds alluring at first, once you consider its implications, its ecological implications and even political implications, it's actually a nightmare. And that's why Marx never advocated for the total elimination of work as the endpoint of the reduction of work hours through automation. Plus, we need to consider the energy consumption of a fully automated economy. And here Saito gives an example like, the one of the apples and the land, but with a factory. He writes, let's say a new piece of technology is introduced into a factory that allows a task that used to be performed by 10 people to be performed by 1. The factory would thus become 10 times more productive, but that doesn't mean the individual worker will gain 10 times the skill. Rather, the productive force of 9 workers has been replaced by fossil fuel energy. The worker, as wage slave, has been replaced by fossil fuel as energy slave. The important thing to consider here is the high energy returned on energy invested, or ROI, of fossil fuel use. The return on high investment of energy is the measure of how many units of energy are gained per unit of energy spent. So same thing here, a machine is introduced and it raises the productivity, since just 1 or 2 people can now perform as much as 10 people. So with the technology, the factory or the land becomes at least 10 times more productive. But as Saito says, this doesn't mean that the one person who remains to run the machine becomes 10 times more skilled than he was when he had 9 colleagues working with him. The skills of those 9 workers who were laid off didn't get transferred to this one worker left. So the increase in productivity came from something else, the fossil fuel that runs the machine. So the machine replaced the 9 workers and their skills, which are no longer needed, and all it does is provide enough energy for just the remaining worker to keep using only his skill, but combined with the energy of the machine. Now he can produce either as much or more than when the factory had 10 workers. So the worker is still a wage slave, but now the skills of the 9 other wage slaves were replaced by the machine powered by fossil fuel, which Saito calls an energy slave. So why a slave first? Well, that's because it is supposed to do the same thing as the worker, to reduce costs by putting an output that outweighs the input. For the factory boss, the worker's cost is supposed to bring him profit, get back more than the cost. The same is expected from the machine in terms of energy. The energy it provides the factory and worker with must be greater than the energy necessary to make it run, necessary to power it. In other words, the end product made by my wage slave and energy slave must overweigh the cost of them both. So fossil fuels function as energy slaves that do the heavy work once done by human labor. That energy is deemed efficient if its cost is outweighed by the benefits. If the energy returned is greater than the energy invested, it's a success. So this is measured by the EROI. It measures the efficiency of an energy source, how much energy you get back from every unit of energy you put in to obtain it. According to Saito, in the 1930s, oil had an extraordinary high EROI. For 1 unit of energy spent, you got 100 units back. And so that meant society had a huge surplus of energy, 99 units to use for other things like transport, manufacturing, heating, etc. But that 1 unit of energy, to be this effective, it depended also on the energy needed to extract it. The harder it is to extract fossil fuel, the lower its EROI gets. And today, for example, its ratio has dropped drastically. Like for 1 unit of energy spent, you got only 10 back. And that's because the easiest way deposits are gone, and it takes more effort, drilling deeper, fracking, refining to extract oil. And by the way, that's the same ratio for solar power. Other sources of energy mentioned are ethanol from corn, but their ratio is null. Like 1 unit of energy is produced for every unit spent. So ethanol is basically pointless as an energy source because you spend as much energy producing it as you get out of it. So despite its decreasing EROI, fossil fuel remains one of the best energy options in terms of efficiency. But this is where we run into a dilemma. Fossil fuel causes climate change, right? But these fuels give us a lot of usable surplus energy. Renewable and sustainable energy and biomass don't give us that ratio. Their EROI is lower than fossil fuels. It means that the surplus energy that we get from it is smaller than the surplus with fossil fuel. And so this means that it is even harder to extract or produce than fossil fuels. So again, you end up having to choose between either an energy source that has a high ratio of EROI, but that causes climate change, or that doesn't cause climate change, but with a very low EROI, and a low EROI is incompatible with economic growth. If you transition to energy sources with low EROI, then you have to accept a slowing down of economic activity. And in note 155, Saito mentions a study by a Spanish university titled Dynamic Energy Return on Energy Investment, so EROI, and Material Requirements in Scenarios of Global Transition to Renewable Energies. And so in it, the scholars, they discuss the viability of the green growth narrative, that we can achieve, decoupling between economic activities increase and the consumption of energy and materials. In other words, combining economic growth with the increase in environmental protection. And so this narrative suggests measures to achieve that transition, such as a substantial increase in efficiency improvements, the electrification of the system, for example, the transformation of the transportation sector, and the rapid transition to low-carbon energy sources. Now again, Saito isn't opposed to these measures, but he actually welcomes them and encourages them. What he argues is that you cannot use these measures for the purposes of maintaining economic growth and the current levels of production and consumption. That's because, as the study shows, economic growth is predicated on a high ratio of energy returned and invested. But only fossil fuel energies or polluting energies can guarantee a bigger return of energy over investment of energy. Renewable energies will always have lower EROI than fossil fuels. So you end up having to choose. Yes, renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar energies, they don't pollute, and therefore they will technically be cheaper, since you don't have to invest more money to clean up the pollution they produce, or their green gas emissions. But in order to supply the same level of energy destined to society's use, meaning the same level of energy that is required to satisfy our current lifestyle, renewable energy sources are not enough. Renewable energy cannot keep up with the current demand of energy, the net energy to society, or maintaining the current levels of prosperity of today's society. In other words, let's just say that today's demand is at 100 units of energy. That's how much you need. To produce 100 units of energy, you need 10 units of fossil fuel energy, but 80 units of renewable energy. So the EROI in the first case will be at 10, while in the second it will be about 1.2. Eventually, renewable energy won't be enough, and the cost will increase rapidly, and thereby hindering productivity and with it growth. And as the study says, in the case of electricity, achieving high penetration levels of renewables in the electric system by 2060, consistent with the green growth narrative, it would decrease the EROI standard of the entire global system from the current 12:1 ratio to between 3 and 5:1 ratio by the mid-century. And so these EROI levels are well below the threshold required to sustain the high levels of economic development in current industrial complex societies, which will compel us to increase the production of energy by 35% in order to maintain the current level of net energy to society if we transition to renewable energy. If you transition to renewable energy while wanting to maintain the same levels of growth. So the increase in energy investment would imply a higher primary energy consumption, meaning that the resources needed to create that green energy, which in turn would intensify the issues of environmental impacts and resource depletion. Like renewable energy sources, if we deploy them, their deployment would require a huge amount of minerals relative to the current estimated levels of reserves and resources. We will have to use even more resources, which means that we'll end up back to rematerialization of the economy, which would exacerbate eventual mineral risk availability in the future. So the solution would be to transition to an economy that doesn't require this much net energy delivered to society while offering genuine prosperity to that society. And this society can only be a degrowth communist society. So to decarbonize society, we must transition to energy sources with lower EROI. And what consequence awaits us if we do that in both capitalist and productivist communism? Well, an ecological disaster on the one hand, because if you want to keep the same levels of production we have right now with low EROI energy sources, then the amount of quantity that you need of that energy is just astronomical. And given that they already, demand so much energy to be produced in the first place, with the renewable energy sources, they demand so much energy to be produced in the first place. I mean, if we are talking about this much a quantity of renewable energy sufficient to power and to keep the same levels of degrowth and production and consumption that we have today, you will very soon run out of resources to convert to the energy that you need to produce the amount of green energy necessary to keep the current levels of production, even if everything that you produce is based on use value, by the way. So for human beings to be liberated from work while maintaining our current lifestyles and levels of production, there is no energy source that can sustain the shit without destroying the planet. So the alternative would be to give up on those catchphrases of, liberating people from work. If you want to maintain the production levels of productivism, you will have to face a very bleak reality that you cannot count on green energy to do that. So what are we going to do? You are going to ask people to work more in order to compensate. First, sustainable energy cannot replace everything. As Saito says, even if we get to fossil fuel our cars and machines with sources of renewable energy, if we power them with the sources of renewable energy, that energy won't be able to also replace the fertilizers needed for agriculture, the concrete needed for construction, the iron and steel needed for manufacturing, and so on. But even if you manage to replace fossil fuel completely with sustainable energy, its low EROI would put you in a dilemma. Either you will have to produce so much EROI that the energy consumed for its production generates as much emission, if not more, and even if it produces lower emissions, it still produces enough to accelerate climate change, or you accept that the economy will inevitably slow down, which impedes growth, but if you don't want that, then it means that you will have to call people back into the assembly line. People will become your second source of green energy to compensate for that economic growth loss. And so there is no way around it. If you wish to decrease carbon dioxide emissions, you have to decrease productivity. And so this is called the emission trap in note 156. Saito mentions the book Managing Without Growth by Peter E. Victor. We already mentioned it in the chapter on green Keynesianism. Here's the reference for the productivity trap and how green growth is actually recoupling the GDP and its material footprint. It's the same thesis as in the study about EROI. By the way, Victor has a whole chapter in the book about the myth that economic growth is necessary for happiness or well-being. I know we already discussed this a lot, and we will also discuss it a bit later, then also next week with the final chapter. But if you still want more arguments for why economic growth and happiness are two different things, you can check Victor's book. Anyway, so the emission trap. Again, I'm referring to the first edition of Victor's book, the 2008 one, while Saito uses the 2019 edition. So the page numbers aren't the same, but the point of that trap, the emission trap, is that you cannot reduce emissions without reducing productivity. So efforts to reduce carbon dioxide emission by cutting fossil fuel use, by slowing material throughput, or switching to renewables, they inherently reduce economic productivity and growth. If, on the other hand, you don't want to reduce productivity, meaning that you don't want production to slow down, then you either refuse to reduce the amount of energy slaves, but that would be deadly for the environment, or you tell humans that they have to work long hours again. So this is the deal. If you want to make work days shorter, you cannot keep the same levels of productivity and production. This means that shortening work hours is inextricably tied to deceleration, and that's the only feasible way to also reduce carbon emissions. There's no other way to reduce emissions than by the slowing of production. But since the talk of liberation from work and elimination of work can only make sense if we don't slow production, if productivity is so high that only machines can do everything for us, then there is no way we can reduce emissions. And so these dreams can never be realized in a decarbonized society. The only way is to transition to sustainable renewable energy, but accept what it entails. That we have to accept the slowing of production and productivity levels, and this means that we still work, but we don't work as much as we would have in economies run on fossil fuels or in growth-oriented economies run on sustainable energy. On the contrary, we would actually work less, way less, and our productive forces can be concentrated on areas where they are truly needed. So no more meaningless work that produces little use value, and no more emissions. And this can only be achieved if we work less and if we reduce production or slowing down the economy and therefore degrowth. And so in short, the second pillar is about admitting the emission trap, that it is inevitable to reduce productivity levels, and therefore we also have to reduce our working hours. So this is not to eradicate work, but to precisely make work meaningful and attractive again. Quote, "This is why we must pay attention once more to Marx's call for the content of labor to become fulfilling and attractive again. It is only based on such a transformation that we can imagine the rest of the way forward." Alright, so now the third pillar, abolishing the uniform division of labor. Since the point of degrowth isn't the abolition of work, but making work meaningful, creative, and fulfilling and attractive, what really needs to be abolished is not work, but the division of labor. The opposition to creative labor is uniform labor, which is the kind of labor produced by the division of labor. Uniformity refers to the monotonous, repetitive, and standardized nature of labor. When work is divided into highly specialized tasks, like on an assembly line, each worker repeats the same narrow function over and over. And so this strips labor of variety, creativity, and individuality, producing uniform tasks and consequently uniform workers' experiences. So you have sameness in tasks, workers doing repetitive, standardized functions, and this leads to a loss of creativity and diversity because it leaves no room for innovation or self-expression. And if these are promoted, it's only for those in charge of consumption. They get to innovate and express themselves, while workers, they simply execute. So the result is that sameness dehumanizes workers. People work, and even their lifestyles becomes dull, mechanical, and identical. So from sameness in tasks, we get to dehumanizing sameness of lives. Making work attractive now in the Marxist sense is precisely breaking this sameness. Shortening work days would be ineffective if we don't abolish the division of labor which produces this sameness. Tedious work, even if performed for a few hours during the day, would still be stressful and taxing, which will force people to turn to consumerism for stress release. So this was, for example, the case of the Soviet Union. Saito says that when you look at images of work in the USSR, it's hard to believe that Marx really called for labor to become, attractive work. Soviet life was still shaped by uniformity. Under Soviet industrial organization, the division of labor was intensified, and each worker was locked into repetitive, standardized, mechanized tasks. And factories, they churned out identical products, and social life was often represented as drab, monotonous, and conformist. Work remained tedious and uniform despite, shorter hours or collective ownership of production. And so the system replicated capitalist monotony instead of transcending it. And today this is viewed as one of the biggest mistakes of the USSR that led to its downfall, because many Soviets lamented over the fact that they don't have much variety in consumer goods. For example, during the Brezhnev era, Soviet citizens, they were gradually becoming more consumerist, up to that point, the USSR was extremely distrustful of consumerist tendencies, viewing it as a capitalist behavior, and therefore the government issued warnings, imposed restrictions, and tried to spread its suspicions onto the public regarding consumption of foreign products. But you can't, on the one hand, make work uniform, thereby making life uniform, and then expect that people won't resort to consumerism to feel the slightest difference in their lives and to release the stress from uniform work on the other. There's a book that I recommend on this subject. It's about, consumer culture in the USSR. The book is called Soviet Consumer Culture in the Brezhnev Era by historian Natalia Chernyshova. One of the passages that struck me while reading it was when she mentioned the Deputy Minister for Education, Lyubov Baliesnaya. I think that's how it is pronounced. I'm not sure. I'm sorry about the pronunciation, but yeah. Pronunciation is always bad. My pronunciation is always bad when it comes to names. So the uniformity of life in the Soviet regimes made it so that its citizens were constantly comparing their consumer goods with those of many Western capitalist countries, and they often conclude that Western products were far superior when it came to fashion, shoes, perfume, stereo players, or home fittings. And hence the need to keep up with the West in the quality and variety of consumer goods. And so this concerned Baliasneya, who admitted at a public roundtable that even children are dissatisfied. Whenever she offers her son a present, for example, his first question about it was, is it imported? And he even begged her to allow him to tell his friends that it was, even if it was, Soviet made. And this is where she uttered a phrase that kind of became famous. She said, "We produce Sputniks, but we don't have pretty underwear for women." And so in short, when life is so uniform, because work is uniform, even technological advancement won't matter that much. It doesn't matter if you can send hundreds of satellites to orbit the Earth, because happiness is actually in smaller things than the greatest achievements of humanity. So if we really want to break from consumerism, what we need to do is to transform the content of work, and not just the time of work, to reduce our stress and make our lifestyles more humane again. And so this again means abandoning those utopian visions of fully automated futures. If machines replace work, even in communism, those machines still need to be monitored, and as such human work would simply be reduced to that, monitoring machines. Even if that would make our workday shorter, if all we do is just monitoring technology, that takes away any meaningful aspect of work. And therefore this form of communism can still reproduces the division of labor, and it will be no different from the subsumption of work by capital in capitalist society. Now, to mention that the consumerism and attraction for Western products is itself an illusion of variety, not to mention, sorry, did I say now? Not to mention that, the consumerism and attraction of Western products, that's, also an illusion of variety. Like, there's no real variety in capitalism either. The capitalist mode of production is as uniform and standardizing than that of the Soviet Union, if not more. So whenever you have the division of labor, and products will be at the same end, will all be the same, will all be the same even if you put them in different packages. And work's content will always be monotonous, and workers will be stripped of their agency and autonomy even if they work just a few hours per day. So to quote Saito, looking at the sites of production today, we can see how the subsumption by capital enabled by automation is making workers mere monitors of machines. The thorough standardization of production has made efficiency rise by leaps and bounds, but at the same time it has stripped workers of their autonomy. More and more work has become more and more repetitive, meaningless, and dissatisfying to perform. So again, we need to make transformations in the site of production, in the labor process itself, and not outside of it or around it. Reformists and the first generation of degrowth theorists, they adopted that strategy. They don't try to make work attractive or creative. They are content with leaving the structure of labor as it is, but try to make, what lies outside of it attractive. Creative and social activities are just activities that you do outside work. So work itself cannot be creative or a social activity if we follow this logic. So the only outcome is therefore to use as much automation as we can to reduce working hours for the purpose to make tedious and taxing labor easier to bear. But labor has to be made easier to bear only if we perceive it as a burden, as tedious and taxing. If you want to make X easier to bear, it means that X isn't attractive. It's a burden that you carry that you cannot get rid of, and so the only thing to do is to make that burden a bit lighter. But this is looking at work in the wrong way. First, the necessity of reducing work hours isn't, to make work easier to bear, because work isn't supposed to be tedious or taxing. What mediates humans with nature, and thus what makes humans, well, humans, isn't supposed to be a burden. It only becomes a burden in the division of labor, when the labor process is divided into repetitive and standardized tasks, when workers have no autonomy or agency over what they do. To see work as a burden that we are supposed to make lighter or easier to bear is precisely a vision that doesn't see the metabolic interaction with nature. It's a vision that lacks an ecological dimension. Only by forgetting about nature that we take this approach of eliminating or evading work altogether. This cannot be further from what Marx intended for work to be. He, Marx, envisions labor becoming attractive work that has created the subjective and objective conditions for itself to be the basis of an individual's self-realization. The point is not simply not to simply increase the amount of free time that exists outside labor, but to eliminate torment and meaninglessness from labor itself. We must transform work into something creative, an avenue for self-realization. So that quote from Marx that comes from the Grundrisse in the famous passage where he talks about attractive work from the sixth notebook from the chapter on Capital, and precisely on the in the section on Adam Smith and the notion of work as sacrifice. If you have the Penguin edition, it's on page 611. Now that section on Adam Smith and also on Proudhon, there's a footnote where he discusses briefly Proudhon. So that section, which goes on for about 6 pages, is divided into a part where Marx addresses Smith's view of labor as sacrifice, and then the part where Smith gives us the origins of profits. We'll only discuss the first part here, that notion of work as sacrifice. And consequently, we will mention the misconception that Marx argues that value comes from labor time. Maybe you've heard that before, that Marx says that the value of product equals the labor time to make that product, or that wages should be the equivalent of labor time. For example, I worked 1 hour, so I should receive an appropriate salary equivalent to that hour regardless of what I produced. If you and I produced different things, but spent the same amount of time working to produce those things, well, those things have the same value and we receive the same wages. So this isn't Marx, but it's actually Adam Smith. And Marx is criticizing this, that the value of labor comes from the time of labor. He criticizes this by challenging what this view presupposes about labor, meaning that it sees labor as sacrifice. For Adam Smith, labor is a curse, just like in the biblical narrative where labor is a punishment for the sins of Adam. It's something that we would rather avoid because it disturbs our tranquility, freedom, and happiness, in Smith's words. When we work, we are not in tranquility, we are not free, we are not happy. But we do it because it's a necessary step, it's a necessity to then go back or to secure our tranquility, freedom, and happiness. It's like an exchange. Okay, we sacrifice a time we wish to spend or could spend in that state of tranquility, freedom, and happiness, but like all sacrifices, it's done for a reward. Our wages is the reward for that, which then, allows us to go back into that state of tranquility. So this means that the value of labor, technically it never changes, since the only thing that determines it is the time spent doing that sacrifice. But what does this suggest to us? Well, it suggests that work can never be itself included in that state of tranquility, freedom, and happiness. When we are in that state, we are in a state of non-labor. Doing a free activity, an activity that makes you happy, or an activity that fosters tranquility, isn't considered labor, and as such, you don't receive anything for it. Here, for Smith, work must always be an activity that is forced on us, that is external to us. So when we work, which is to overcome obstacles, Smith wouldn't consider us liberating ourselves through that activity. That work, the overcoming of obstacle, is itself liberating as much as existing in liberated states. So he makes the usual bourgeois mistake of missing historical processes. The notion of work as sacrifice is a historical construct and not the natural state of labor. Smith is right to posit that labor is always repulsive, always an external forced labor, and not labor, by contrast, is freedom and happiness, but only in its historic forms as slave labor or serf labor or wage labor. Marx, however, says that in communism, labor would no longer be a sacrifice. It wouldn't be separate from tranquility, freedom, and happiness, but its very conditions. In communism, work is also done in tranquility, in freedom, and in happiness, because in work we will experience those concepts. We will experience tranquility, freedom, and happiness as we labor. And so in this sense, labor becomes attractive. And Marx insists that by attractive, he doesn't mean that labor becomes like play, mere fun, or mere amusement. This is the view of the utopian socialists, like for example Charles Fourier, who he criticizes for his naivety. So attractive work doesn't mean fun work, but work that derives its value not from the time of labor, which for Marx is like the pre-industrial way of thinking, where people sacrifice resources for their gods, or from the market, but from use value. And like we've seen with Saito's reading of Marx, use value is embedded in the metabolic interaction with nature. That is why, while Marx praises pre-capitalist societies in many aspects, the fact that many believe in sacrifices for the gods means that they don't have a full grasp on nature. In communism, however, labor has two characteristics. First, its social character is posited, meaning that we are aware that it is a collective and social activity designed to express and realize our freedom. And secondly, it has a scientific character and performed by a subject. And so this is very important. Marx says that it doesn't mean that humans must use science to dominate nature or become themselves a force of nature. Instead, he says that they become a subject, a self-reflecting subject that regulates rather than controls the forces of nature, that acts harmoniously and rationally with its metabolism. Labor is therefore liberating because it allows us to regulate the forces of nature instead of being a chaotic, spontaneous, and irrational force that destroys nature and is on top of that unattractive. So making labor attractive, and how can we do that? Well, we can start by abolishing the division of labor in order to return creativity and autonomy to work. This entails that we have to break away from standardized and efficient work, which again will reduce productivity and production. And that's why capitalism is so attached to the division of labor. Dividing the labor process into repetitive tasks does indeed increase productivity and production. But we have been arguing through this entire book why production and productivity need to slow down. So that's a given. And we don't need to explain again why. I think that at this point it has to become very clear why levels of production and productivity need to go down. So this is not a dilemma. In a dilemma, the two options, they need to be as valuable, or at least the negative consequences of each must be more or less equal. That's what makes a dilemma a difficult choice. But here, our choice is between tedious and taxing work, but high productivity and production, and creative and autonomous work, but low productivity and production. But this isn't really a difficult choice. Okay, by now it should be obvious. It's only difficult choice if you are seeking profits, meaning that if you just value exploiting other people on the earth for a few bucks, even if that means that you lower the quality of life of those you exploit and destroy the earth. But you know, once we don't value profits, well, clearly one choice is just bad while the other is just good, because you get to have fulfilling life with you know, the choice of degrowth. And now we also have to stress again that low production and productivity is not poverty. Okay, what creates poverty is precisely these high levels of production and productivity based on an alienated form of labor. So abolishing the division of labor in order to make work attractive, and if work is indeed attractive, you have to accept low levels in productivity and production, which again isn't a bad thing at all. But how the abolition of the division of labor leads to attractive work? Well, of course, just abolishing it won't make work attractive just like that. You know, you need another organization of labor. And this organization, being contrasted with the division of labor, where everyone just does one repetitive task over and over again, must be the opposite. Workers can engage in a wide variety of tasks and activities. So the more tasks and activities you can engage in, the greater the autonomy and agency, and therefore greater freedom and creativity. And again, keep in mind that this is in a context of short work days in a degrowth communist setting. So it doesn't mean that you work more or that you are doing tasks that others should be doing but they were laid off. Long work hours and unemployment don't exist in this scenario. You don't need wages to have access to resources to satisfy your needs. Plus, we're still talking about necessary work here. We're not talking about leisure activities, those outside of work, the activities of the realm of freedom in Marxist terminology. We're just talking about the realm of necessity here. In Marxism, you don't have two realms in the sense that one is a burden while the other is the one in which we are happy and free. You don't have the sphere of toil and then the sphere of creativity. Both spheres are actually creative. Both must be organized on these principles of creativity and autonomy. So even when we work to secure the necessities of life, the biological and social life, that work too must be attractive. Machines are here just to make that work, that work more attractive by making it physically easier, sure, but not to do it for us at our place, you know. To make it easier means opportunities for more creativity, not efficiency. In capitalism, all that talk about creativity and innovation is just, cover up for efficiency. Being creative in your work in capitalism means finding ways to increase productivity and production. In communism, however, creativity simply means agency and self-expression. Being creative simply means that workers have more freedom by having more control over the production process. And again, this is to ensure a better respect of nature's cycles. Don't ever forget that. This is all related to ecology. So allowing people to be more creative with their labor means that people can develop more skills. Capitalism doesn't want that. It doesn't want you to develop more skills. And even if you do, capitalism would just see you as a machine, as someone who can replace other jobs. And so this means that if you develop more skills under capitalism, you will prevent others to do so because the boss will just keep you and fire the others. Plus, he will make you do more hours. So you cannot be creative in capitalism, since being creative means acquiring or developing more skills or developing more your already existing skills, and capitalism doesn't want that. If capitalism allows people to develop skills to be able to perform multiple tasks and activities, capitalism will actually lose a lot of time. You will produce more if people can only do one thing each than if they can do, many things each. Now, Saito here refers to two things in particular that are at the heart of the division of labor. The crucial division occurs between physical and mental labor. And so this is the distinction between execution and conception. Someone has the skill to come up with a plan, someone else has the skill to just execute the plan. On a greater level, this can correspond to the opposition between town and country, the urban and the rural opposition. And so this division of labor ultimately leads to exploitation. If someone simply makes the consumption but the other executes, the person who is executing must execute for two people, for himself and for the other who made the conception. So if an architect makes the plan for a building, the construction workers must make the architect's house and also his own house. So on the level of town and country, the country must produce the food to feed the farmers, but also those who are in town. So the farmer needs to grow the food for himself and for someone else, that the other person who came up with the idea of this organization. Since this is justified on the basis of efficiency, like we produce more food this way and for lower costs, but the implications for the quality of work and the environment are actually pretty expensive. From an economic point of view, the cost is low, but for the quality of our lives and even survival, the cost is high. We have already seen this when we discussed how modern agriculture is not letting the soil replenish itself fast enough because the waste of the food consumed in town doesn't go back to the soil and is instead thrown in the ocean, forcing farmers to rely on industrial fertilizers, by the way, to maintain the soil's fertility. So not only it deprives the farmers of self-sufficiency, since now they rely on industries to sell them fertilizers so that they can produce food to sell that food, but those fertilizers are actually damaging the soil's natural cycles and the ecosystems. And so that's why we insisted that food must be produced locally so that this opposition between the urban and the rural finally breaks down. Likewise, the opposition between execution and consumption needs to break down as well. This is another point that Marx emphasizes even during his late writings. Saito quotes from the Critique of the Gotha program that he, Marx, states that future society will come about once the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, which means that work can become not only a means of life, but life's prime want. Only then can the all-around development of the individual be realized. So that's when he discusses the higher phase of communist society. I remember in the Critique of the Gotha program, that's when he argued that socialism is a transition between capitalism and communism, as interpreted by Lenin. Socialism is the lower phase of communism, and then the higher phase is full mature communism, where everyone lives freely according to their own abilities and their needs. We already criticized Lenin's interpretation of that passage, so no need to go back to it, but the idea is clear. In the higher phase of communism, we have the abolition of the division of labor, the separation of conception and execution between mental and physical labor. And so this is again a criticism of the idea that work is a sacrifice, that it is just an annoying activity that we do because we have to. That's just for survival, and therefore it's just a means to life. For Marx, however, work isn't a mere means to life. We don't work just because we have to in order to live. It's not a means to an end, at least in the survival sense. It is actually life's prime want, as he says. We live to work and not the other way around. But again, this is often co-opted in capitalism to give an absurd meaning to it. We live to work seems pointless and absurd. It's like we've made work a turmoil, and thus again it's a sacrifice. But for Marx, work is supposed to be enjoyable and attractive. It's through work that we express ourselves, that we experience who we are, that we develop our identity, that we become an individual. The all-round development of the individual, that's the point of work. We live to enjoy life, and what makes life enjoyable is labor. It's only in capitalism, when labor becomes a means to life, that labor becomes pointless, that we exist just to toil and suffer. But when we see labor as the site of individual productivity, as the site of individual freedom and expression, when labor is conducted freely in the setting of a free association, in communal management of the commons, when labor becomes again the mediator between us and nature and among each other, then labor is attractive. So this is also in relation to our talk about the importance of a lifelong, equalized vocational education for all. Vocational training means, learning practical skills, and it's also what worker cooperatives and other types of cooperative organizations promote. Usually, cooperatives give training lessons in a wide variety of skills, depending on their goal, size, and sector. Many cooperatives, especially in skilled trades or craft-based industries like carpentry, manufacturing, or software, they train their own members to develop the skills necessary for the work. This is often on-the-job training, apprenticeships, or mentoring from experienced worker owners. Examples, like for example, a bakery cooperative might train new members in bread making, in hygiene and consumer services, and cooperative governance. But some cooperatives can extend education beyond their membership. They can offer workshops, courses, or partnerships with local vocational schools, supporting professional development so members gain certifications or qualifications. And so this can be part of their social mission, especially in cooperatives that aim to empower workers or support local communities. So this is necessary to establish those social relations based on mutual aid. So we need to have multiple skills to help one another, to assist one another, and to plan production collectively. Only then workers will be able to overcome subsumption by capital and truly become masters of industry, like Saito says. So the point is to become self-sufficient again, so that we stop relying on capital and its subsumption process. So this again can only be done in a degrowth setting. You cannot, promote the abolition of the division of labor, promote vocational training, while still holding on to economic growth. And again, you cannot have economic growth without high levels of production and productivity. And so these measures by Marx in his later life are simply incompatible with growth. So wanting to empower workers, wanting them to have more control and agency over production, means that production must slow down. Earlier I said that efficiency and creativity in work are two distinct things, and they cannot be confused or made compatible, unless by efficiency you mean something else than productivity. And productivity, in capitalism. But the two are incompatible. Okay, you can have efficiency with the division of labor, efficiency in its capitalist sense, but you cannot have creativity. Creativity is only compatible with degrowth. And here too, the degrowth stance, this is what Saito is saying, the degrowth stance of Marx in his later years comes into play to push things further. Abolishing the uniform division of labor to restore humanity to labor necessarily entails deprioritizing the type of efficiency meant to promote economic growth. Work would be performed for the satisfaction of doing it or for its benefits to others, not to make money. The breadth of work would also expand, with workers performing more different kinds of labor, even rotating jobs in an equal manner or contributing on a local basis, all of which would naturally contribute to the slowdown of economic activity. We must see this as a good thing. So I think that this is crystal clear. It's everything that we've been, saying so far. And of course, this cannot be understood as a rejection of technology and science. That's Saito's last point before turning to the next pillar. Like I said, the point of technology is to help us develop that agency. If we use science and technology for efficiency purposes, to produce more, way beyond our needs, and then make access to that production predicated on money, if that's why we are using science and technology, then in pre-industrial societies, where everything had to be done manually and where people were vulnerable to superstition, to disease, to child mortality, to predators, to unfathomable natural phenomena, where labor was indeed very tiresome, still those people enjoyed greater freedom than we do. So with technology, we actually have more than enough to unleash and liberate our creativity. We can make work so attractive that its relation to a torture device or toil will really be just one phase of human history. technology and science's purposes is to make work attractive, not to reinforce our subsumption to capital or, promise us that one day work itself will be a phase of human history. So it must enable workers to engage in a wider range of activities than they could, previously. It could and should foster more freedom and autonomy and self-sufficiency, and this is possible and with shorter work days. But of course, this kind of technology that will enable us to do so is an open technology. We already explained what those are and what an open technology is when we discussed André Gorz's terminology and distinction between open and locking technologies in Chapter 6. As a reminder, locking technology is a technology that is, by its own nature, it requires a hierarchical, vertical control and management of that technology. It's the kind of technology that paves the way for dominion over workers and consumers. Fossil fuel, coal, they are prime examples of locking technologies. Nuclear power is another example. Even if they are more expensive than open technologies, like for example hydropower, capitalist and state bureaucracy will privilege those forms of technology because, they are more efficient to make profits. It's necessary to exert dominion and control over workers if you are opting for locking technologies. So that's why it doesn't make sense for communism to function with locking technologies, and it goes without saying that locking technologies are an ecological disaster. All the infrastructure required to keep them safe so that they don't cause any leaks in the environment necessitate that workers and citizens in general are kept at bay from locking technologies. Only an all-powerful authority can manage it without causing environmental destruction. To be more precise, only an all-powerful authority can manage it to minimize the environmental destruction. If you are using a locking technology just to produce it or extract it, you are certainly going to cause a certain destruction. You are going to release tons of carbon emissions anyways, and so the climate crisis isn't about minimizing damage, it's about no longer causing damage. So while we still need science and technology in degrowth communism, that technology, in order to abolish the division of labor and allow for creative work to re-emerge, it needs to be an open technology. So the transition to an economy that prioritizes the production of use value relies on transitioning to open technologies as well. And this brings us to the fourth pillar, the necessity of democratizing the production process. So the transition to use value, to an economy based on use value, the shortening of the work days, the abolition of the division of labor with the transition to open technologies, and by the way, that's what energy transition must be about. It must be about the only sustainable transition, the only sustainable energy transition is one towards open technologies. So all of this is done so that workers become the owners of the means of production and thereby establishing democracy in the workplace. Making work attractive and all of that, this is what it must lead to, democracy in the production process, giving workers decision-making power over production. So the democratization of the production process means social ownership. When the means of production are socially and collectively owned, when they are managed as commons, then you get democracy. So once citizens slash workers, and by the way, like citizens slash workers, this also includes non-citizens. It actually includes everyone, so no one should be excluded from the production process. So once everyone owns the means of production, decisions over production can really be taken democratically. And so this is the participatory socialism that we saw last week with Piketty. To quote Saito, social ownership would allow the means of production to be managed dramatically as a form of commons. Decisions about what technologies to introduce into the workplace and how to use these technologies would be made democratically through discussion and debate. So this is the democratization of the production process. You know, the democratization principle of the production process applies also to everything related to that process. Like, it's not just, you know, making decisions in the workplace, like workers have only agency inside their factories or offices. It's just, you know, limited to the technology and physical labor during production in this sense. Instead, you know, the principle must also apply to decisions regarding energy and raw materials as well. And these two must be produced and distributed democratically. For example, it wouldn't make sense to have democracy in a factory that is completely powered by an electric company using nuclear energy. So we too, in order to power our houses, need to produce the electricity locally for local consumption. So obviously this, again, will mean deceleration. Democratizing the production process would go hand in hand with decelerating the economy. Democratizing the production process means the communal management of the means of production through free association. In other words, deciding democratically what and how much should be produced and how. So sure, democracy doesn't mean consensus and straight-up agreements. Opinions will diverge on matters this complex. You can even expect that these debates and disagreements can take a form of violent conflicts. But remember that we see violence every day with the current system already. And certainly way more violence is inflicted on workers and citizens in capitalism than it would be in a fully democratized production process. So, whenever someone panics and starts demanding from you to reassure them beyond what is reasonable, whenever someone starts ranting about how people cannot agree and so they need authority to avoid these disagreements so that these disagreements don't escalate into violence, well, just tell them that we are already in that state of affairs, where, disagreement escalates into violence. We are already suffering violence from capitalism, from the state apparatus, from the police, from the bureaucratic institutions. Tell them that quite often our disagreements between each other aren't as deadly and harmful as when they are between us and capital or capitalism or, the state. So if the principle of a state is to make sure that disagreements don't lead to an escalated violence, then how can you explain the violence that so many people go through every day just by disagreeing with the state? Why aren't people more afraid from the institutions and economic systems that are causing violence right now than from the potential violence of conflicts within spaces of democratic labor? Okay? And by the way, these institutions and economic systems, they have been causing this violence not just on people, but on the whole planet, to the point where we are on the verge of climate Armageddon. We know that democratizing the production process will also lead to conflicts of opinions, and consensus takes time to build. And of course, we are still we will still have, a state and institutions. After all, Saito isn't an anarchist, unfortunately, but their power to intervene in our deliberative and participatory process will be radically reduced. And this is a good thing, because so far, with the great power accorded to the state, not only it wasn't able to limit capitalism's destructive course, but it is also actually, complicit with it. And we have already ruled out any authoritarian alternative to solve climate change. So this is the best deal you will ever get, even though it scares you. So democratizing the labor process, having workers decide on the political matters that are usually left to politicians, to experts, and a minority of shareholders, this is the way out of climate change. We cannot let decisions about and within industries made up by top-down directives. Like Saito says, if we let things as they are, then all decisions will only reflect the wishes of a minority, a small group of majority shareholders. And currently, in major industries, what we got is an undemocratic decision-making process solely based on the wishes of management. And here Saito says something very interesting. He argues that this undemocratic process allows for quick and decisive response to moment-by-moment changes in the world of business. In other words, having just a few shareholders, a small minority calling the shots, is great for business, since you constantly need to adapt to changing circumstances, and indeed when your success depends on the right and appropriate response to the market, you cannot afford to take your time. You must, you must take quick decisions, and everything needs to happen fast, so you cannot afford to waste a single second. A democratic process, by contrast, since it relies on the participation of the majority, takes time. And like I said, building up consensus takes also a long time, and it's only possible after long debates and deliberative sessions, and that are often heated. But these debates are necessary. Wanting to save time at all costs may be good for efficiency, but efficiency is not only robbing us of our agency, but also of our planet, the two things that are needed for a fulfilling life. So this is without even mentioning the poor quality of products out of an undemocratic labor process. So again, we need to decelerate economic activity. The efficient, adaptive, quick strategy of the undemocratic process simply responds to the tyranny of capital. And this again is that subsumption produced by capital of, the subsumption of everything. And every single aspect of labor must answer to the demands of capital so that it continues its self-valorization, even if that means, losing our freedom and its, material conditions. Now, Saito uses the phrase tyranny of capital and he attributes it to Marx, but I don't know where he got that from because I don't recall Marx ever using that expression, and Saito doesn't provide a source for it. So I even try to check, because maybe there is a mistranslation. Maybe they meant subsumption, but apparently the translation is fine from Japanese. That is, tyranny of capital. So I looked it up, and the only source I could find about that expression, tyranny of capital, it comes from Jevons, the guy of the Jevons paradox. He used it in a lecture to trade unions in 1868 called the Trade Societies, Their Objects and Policy. And a quick thing to note, Jevons isn't a communist, he's a capitalist who just find a paradox in capitalists' use of resources. The fact that Saito mentions him or used his paradox as a critique of capitalism and of decoupling doesn't mean that the dude is a socialist. He was a capitalist and he was against unions and workers demanding higher wages, and like Proudhon, he was against strikes. So he goes from time to time to give a lecture to unions in hopes to convince them not to strike or demand, higher wages, because they would be bad for the economy and for the commonwealth. And so in that lecture, he uses the term tyranny of capital, but in an ironical way. He says that if workers simply comply and cooperate with capitalists, meaning their boss, they will too become capitalists and their conditions will improve, and then they will become their own boss, and then they will make more money. And once they do that, once the worker becomes his own employer, he will cease to complain of the tyranny of capital. So it's an expression that was certainly en vogue at that time in worker circles, so I presume that Marx would use it. It corresponds to how he describes capitalism, that it forces itself on you. So you end up having to do everything on the terms of capital because you are constantly being gaslit that this is the greater system that we got, or it's for the greater good to comply with your boss, and if you don't, the police will make sure that you do. So this is the undemocratic production process. It is undemocratic because it doesn't want to lose time, because that's losing money, and by contrast, the form of production based on free association that Marx proposed gives priority to democracy in the production process, and therefore it's a form of production that is not in a hurry to produce stuff, since its aim is to produce enough for satisfying people's needs, not to increase value. So by its very nature, it would slow down economic activity. And Saito stresses that the Soviet Union failed to adopt this principle of implementing democracy in the production process. So we can't really say that the Soviet was a tyranny of capital, but despite that, it still applied capitalist principles through its tyranny of bureaucracy. So here too you had a minority calling the shots, except that this minority isn't a board of shareholders, but the state. And so this, according to Saito, it runs contrary to everything that Marx stands for, since it doesn't aim at slowing down economic activity. Degrowth Communism aims precisely at that, and hence a democratization of the process, of the production process, is the political organization of labor that is needed. This is the transformation we tease constantly about the transformation that has to occur in the site of production. Once labor becomes democratic, everything changes, production will be transformed at all levels of society, and Saito gives the example of knowledge, particularly know-hows. Think about this. We've seen in the previous chapter that capitalism breeds scarcity, right? The sector of knowledge and information are prime example of this. Under capitalism, skills and knowledge become private property as well, like the secret recipe that the chef takes with him to the grave so that he becomes the only supplier of the sauce. The undemocratic process is rooted in the division of labor between conception and execution. Conception is basically having the know-how, the secret formula, and that's how you maintain your power over workers. Workers, atomized and divided into performing one single task, they cannot know, the formula. They become dependent on your orders. You wouldn't be able to make the slightest profit if everyone knew that formula, because anyone who needs it will simply execute it for themselves, right? So you need to restrict knowledge either through secrecy or by making it illegal for others to use it even if they know it. This is the bullshit known as intellectual property and monopolized platforms. Digital or technological infrastructures controlled by a few dominant companies that concentrate power, data, and profits in their hands. And so these allow new technologies to be patented and thus produce huge profits for certain sectors of major industry like pharmaceutical companies or the GAFA. But in order for them to make those profits, others who can use, those technologies are denied their use unless they buy the patent from them or pay, for those technologies. So here again, we see the irrationality of the system and its paradox. Instead of, treating knowledge and information as commons and thereby sharing it with everyone so that it can, be democratically managed, capitalism prefers leaving the management to just, a few hands. But by doing that, you realize that actually you are not being very productive, right? Because instead of having a radical abundance of know-how, you limit it to just a few individuals capable of putting that knowledge into use. In reality, we would be more productive and efficient with degrowth communism, if we understand productivity and efficiency differently. If we slow down economic activities and democratize the production process from knowledge from know-hows to raw materials and energy control, we would have a society that is constantly innovating. So degrowth, slowing down productivity, production, efficiency, and economic activity, doesn't mean that we make less or innovate less. Actually, we would make more and we will use resources more efficiently. It's just not the kind of efficiency and productivity that capitalism wants, or even when we say produce more, it's not the abundance that capitalism wants. It's not the kind of abundance that you can translate into the GDP, because everything will be free and available, and so no one can make monopoly out of it. So we still have an abundance. Actually, we will have abundance for the very first time. It's just not an abundance of useless shit. And so, we are talking about the abolition of intellectual property and monopolized platforms and all of that crap. Yes, the democratization of the labor process means an abundance of competition for market shares and profits. And here, capitalists, they would, scream that by abolishing the very thing that support market competition, you have taken away motivation for development, and thus you would accelerate the rate of innovation by private enterprise. And the answer is yes. Yes, we want that, except, the thing about motivation for development, because from what we've seen so far, capitalists aren't even keen on development, since actual development, actual human progress, isn't compatible with their favorite economic system. By trying to gaslight us into believing that only private enterprise can innovate, we are led to believe that you need market competition. You need to make things scarce. You need to make knowledge secretive and that shit to be motivated for development. But that's bullshit. People don't need to be in competition to give a crap about making life better for one another. Only the psychopathic the psychopathic capitalist needs that good scare in order to get his lazy ass to contribute. And again, he only does it if you promise him that he will get to treat someone else like a slave. So let's cut the crap once and for all. Capitalism has never motivated development or driven innovation. That we decelerate the rate of private innovation, that's good, because by doing that we become able to accelerate the rate of collective innovation, of public wealth. Our whole discussion about the Lauderdale paradox, for example, from the previous chapter, has shown that already. Private innovation only increases private riches, not public wealth, which decreases as the private riches goes up. So whenever a public innovation occurs, it means more public wealth, so less private riches. Thus, capitalists will go out of their way to make sure that the public never innovates. And since science and technological innovation are first and foremost about making everyone's lives better, they are by essence collective. Capitalists trying to sabotage this collective aspect of science and technology will always do countless maneuvers to limit innovation and development to locking technologies, because they can have control over locking technologies. But simply choosing to develop the technologies that you know can control or capitalize, or you can capitalize on, doesn't mean progress. It is actually more likely to cause the opposite. As Saito points, the development of locking technologies by capitalism to produce artificial scarcity can even obstruct scientific and technological progress. But on the other hand, he says, communism aims to foster the development of new open technologies as commons, enabling the kind treatment of both workers and the planet. So from a productive point of view, just think and ask yourself what kind of technology will improve productivity if my goal isn't profits, but fulfilling lives for everyone. What would it mean then to unleash productive forces and innovation? If I, choose a technology that is very likely to destroy the environment, I have to restrict its access to only a few people, right? It's like I am using a fucking bomb to power cars. I cannot let, everyone access to it to borrow, some electricity from it. I'm the only one who can use it, and so everyone who wants electricity have to go through me. And in this situation, only I develop skills and innovate, whereas the rest of humanity simply waits for my orders. But if I choose a technology that is open, that is sustainable from the very start, that doesn't require confidential and secret knowledge to assure safety. And even if there is a risk, if there is a risk, it's a technology that requires safety skills that can easily be learned by most people. Remember that now we have a lot of time, or a lot of free time, so that educational measures proposed by Marx are more feasible today than they never were at any point in history. And in this situation, more people will have access to this technology, and therefore way more will innovate. Now that we are free from the tyranny of capital and the marketplace and the tyranny of bureaucracy, our abilities will flourish. We will learn new skills and share knowledge, allowing for new innovations to occur that will help increase real productivity through real efficiency. And so this is what Marx meant in his critique of the Gotha program, when he presented communism as the stage in which all productive forces were unleashed. In the high phase of communism, Marx says that the increase in productive forces goes along with the all-around development of the individual. And this all-around development of the individual means that individuals don't have any barriers anymore to develop their skills and faculties, that they, reached full maturity. They don't just know know-hows and the tools and technologies that they use, but they also know about nature and their metabolic interaction with it. Only then, all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, and we can live with a real banner of communism, which is from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So now we get to the last pillar, prioritizing essential work, and this one is perhaps the most important. And this one seems obvious. The democratization of the labor process makes sense only if the priority is given to essential work. In order to convert to a use-value-based economy, we need to prioritize labor-intensive essential work. So we have to explain what that is. Okay, what do we mean by labor-intensive essential work? Well, let's start with essential work. So it's not work which whose sole purpose is biological survival. What is meant by essential work is work that has use value, and you can also say that it is conscious of natural limits and the importance of respecting them. So it's work that doesn't produce for the sake of producing, otherwise it loses its use value, but produces always with the goal of satisfying needs. In other words, it's work that is incompatible with productivism. You cannot raise its productivity so that it produces more of what it produces beyond a certain limits, because if you do, then it can no longer satisfy the needs it was supposed to. You can, also say that it is critical work or self-reflecting work, work that is aware of its anti-capitalist purposes. Let's take an example. In capitalism, work has only one purpose: to increase value by increasing productivity. And therefore, capitalism uses automation and artificial intelligence to raise productivity levels. But the use of technology, while it can be helpful and make work creative, if it exceeds a certain limit, it can make work useless. What was essential work becomes useless work because it's work that serves no need satisfaction now. It becomes abstract work. Its purpose is to increase value. Now, Saito starts by saying that there are many forms of work. Some can be mechanized, meaning that they can be done or executed by machines, and so these involve repetitive, predictable, and standardized tasks, especially ones that machines or softwares can perform, perhaps more efficiently than humans. Examples here include manufacturing assembly line work, like car production, electronics assembly, packaging and sorting in warehouses, data entry or bookkeeping tasks, agricultural tasks like plowing, harvesting, or milking with machines, or basic consumer service handled by chatbots or automated phone systems. So these don't necessarily lose their use value just because they are performed by machines. Here again, it will depend on the purpose of the technology. If it is just to improve productivity, just to increase value, then they will eventually lose their use value. So the take here is that just because a machine does a task that used to be done by a worker, it doesn't mean that we don't have use value anymore. There are forms of work that can be mechanized without becoming useless. But there are others that simply can't. Work that is impossible to mechanize naturally requires human labor. A machine cannot do these types of work, so only humans can. And so these are what we call labor-intensive industries. The point is, degrowth communism will transform our societies not into a society where we only perform labor-intensive industries, but one that values these industries. But to value labor-intensive industries, you need an economy that decelerates, because an accelerating economy, a growth-oriented economy, will only value and prioritize work that can be mechanized. An economy that prioritizes essential work starts here. It first needs to value human labor, labor that only humans can perform. It's about valuing humanity and the kind of work carried by humans and can only be carried by humans. So you take human work as valuable. So this is what should move us more than whether or not that work made us, save a few bucks. If it is carried by humans, then it is, and can only be carried by humans, then it is valuable. Since humans generally take more time to do something than machines, this transition would mean that we don't care about saving time anymore. So we are no longer in a hurry to pursue those dollars. Ultimately, economic activity slows down as profits also crumble. And so prioritizing labor-intensive industries will slow down the economy. A classic example of such an industry is care work. Care work is a form of emotional labor. It's the kind of industry that cannot be run by machinery, and hopefully for self-evident reasons. It's obvious that you cannot automate care work. Automating a process means that you standardize it first. To be able to give it to a machine, you have to isolate its different tasks and give just one to a machine, so we just execute it repetitively. This also means that what the machine works on has to remain the same. You cannot give it something that requires different tasks from the one that you programmed into it. And so this cannot be done in realms of social reproduction that depend on care and communication. Automating care work, for example, means making the task required in it more uniform and standardized. And this is doomed to fail because to be standardized, work and its tasks have to be simple, regular, and predictable. Care work, however, is complex, it is wide-ranging, and regularly involving irregular elements. And these irregular elements cannot be removed from the labor process. If you give it to machines, you will soon find the machines will soon find themselves unable to perform the task and overwhelmed with unrecognizable elements. So it is difficult for automated systems to address. For these reasons, AI or a robot can never be a nurse or a therapist because there is no manual to follow. As Saito says, this is precisely what makes care work a form of production that prioritizes use value. A care worker cannot simply follow a manual to adequately help a patient eat, dress, or take a bath. Care work involves being flexible, responding on a case-by-case basis to another person's character and background. It involves listening to another's daily troubles, building a trust relationship while paying careful attention to small changes in another's body and soul. Childcare and education demand similar forms of attention. So this is why emotional labor is very different from labor in a factory. It's not like, working on an assembly line, because in an assembly line there is no need to acknowledge the feelings of others. But if you are a care worker, acknowledging them is what makes the whole point of your labor. Without that, if a machine is assigned to your place as a care worker, then emotional labor becomes meaningless. But this is precisely the kind of work that cannot be performed without emotional labor. So machines can never do this more efficiently and thus more productively than humans. But also, this kind of work cannot be managed or organized on the principles of the assembly line. You can't, for example, demand that the therapist increases the number of patients by 2 or 3 times. In a factory, you can ask your workers to work more, to produce more, to increase the number of input and material that they have to assemble because they only do just one task. And of course, this is exploitation, but given the principle of productivity and efficiency of a capitalist, this makes sense. Assembly line work isn't compatible with the division of labor. But in care and communication, you cannot do that because, unlike tasks performed on assembly lines, those performed with emotional labor are tasks that take time and require a myriad of different skills. And those receiving this care don't wish for it to be sped up. That would be a recipe for disaster, for more frustration and more anguish for both patient and care worker. So this doesn't mean that you cannot introduce machinery or AI algorithms to help you make decisions, but only to some extent, only as assistance, not to do the emotional labor in your place or perform that labor for productivity and efficiency reasons to cut costs. So in other words, labor-intensive industries cannot be managed through the division of labor or for raising productivity. Their inherent nature, for human purposes, it makes them always, high costs and low in productivity. And guess what? All labor that has use value will always be high cost and low in productivity one way or another. That's why in capitalism, labor-intensive industries suffer from huge budget cuts, and we know the disaster that it represents on the quality of our lives. The whole pandemic, for example, was a catastrophe precisely because our economy is an economy that seeks productivity and low costs. Prioritizing essential work means that we give the priority to what has use value, even if it's high cost and low in productivity. We have tried the alternative countless times anyways, and we saw its disasters. So like Saito says, of course, nursing and caregiving can be streamlined into processes dictated by preset patterns and thus be made more efficient to a certain extent. But if the work is made too productive in this way in order to increase its value, the service's quality, that is its use value, will inevitably suffer. Because of the difficulty of mechanization, labor-intensive industries like care work are seen as high-cost, low-productivity sectors of the economy. For this reason, unreasonable levels of efficiency and demands of it by all levels of management from the very top to the administration on the ground, and it is regularly subjected to irrational restructuring and cost-cutting measures. So, since capitalism doesn't value essential work because it is, completely estranged from use value, not only it prioritizes non-essential work, but it also put extreme pressure on essential work, meaning that capitalism is actively trying to devaluate essential work by making it less appealing and attractive. When we say that Marx wants to make work attractive again, this is in complete opposition to what capitalism does to work. It's capitalism that tries to make work repulsive, meaningless, taxing, and absurd. Whenever you try, or whenever you hear someone complaining that Marxists, the whole discourse, that take Marxists as woke, radical leftists, whenever you hear that someone complain that Marxists and woke don't want to work, that they are just, like children throwing tantrums, keep this in mind. Remind them that it is capitalism that doesn't want you to work because when labor is done by humans, well, value doesn't increase. It's capitalism that tries to make you lazy, that tries to make you hate work. It is capitalism that promises a world liberated from work, not Marx. The usual criticism that we hear, that Marxism is utopian, but when you try, to bring that utopia, all you get is barbarism, that criticism should be directed at capitalism. It is capitalism that promises us liberation from work as a utopia. But then it traps us into the same appalling work that it creates and promised to deliver us from. Like, you have to marvel at the level of gaslight here. Capitalism cannot work unless it destroys use value, unless it organizes labor around the purpose of increasing value. But that means devaluating essential work, the kind of work that is necessary for social reproduction. That, of course, leads to a decaying society. Again, all of the anti-Marxist criticism that comes from conservatives about how they are, the reason why Western civilization is collapsing is so ironic, because if there's anything that is causing the collapse of Western civilization, it is the same economic system that built this civilization. It is capitalism and all of its imperialist imperatives. It's the same irony that when workers realize that they are being replaced by machines, they turn to the same people who protect capitalist interests, the same people that led to their replacement by machines to save their jobs. And those politicians, they will say that these workers, they will say this to these workers the same thing that Jevons says to trade unions, that this is all necessary for the greater good, or that they will save their jobs because they will get rid of the commies, or they will even go as far as celebrating hard work. Like these politicians, the Trumps, the Macrons, the Melanies, the Blairs, and their intellectuals, the Petersons, all of them are lamenting that there are no people who value work anymore, who complain that no one has the right values and wish to see true workers again, on whose work society is founded. These are the same politicians and intellectuals who champion the very economic system that devalues essential work and makes it almost impossible to have a good life if your work is essential. So what do capitalists believe in? They believe that the economy should be left to the market. The market will decide what is objectively more valuable by attributing a certain amount of money to it. In terms of jobs, we simply need to see which jobs get the highest revenues. And these will be the jobs that capitalists value the most then. But oh, what a shocker, the highest paying jobs are not the ones politicians say that they care about. It's not the jobs with the highest use value that get the highest pay. It's those that contribute to the most to increase exchange value. Jobs in industries like marketing, advertising, consulting, finance, and insurance. Following the criteria of the market to determine which jobs are more valuable than others is incompatible with the populist speeches of politicians. The criterion of the market leads to believe that the most important industries are those almost entirely inessential to the reproduction of society, which is just absurd. And by the way, these are called bullshit jobs. Anarchist anthropologist David Graeber, he wrote a very important book about this called Bullshit Jobs. He divides them into 5 categories. You have flunkies, you have goons, you have duct tapers, you have box tickers, and you have task masters. So flunkies, these are jobs that make someone else look or feel important. Doormen, for example, their job is to make the client or their boss feel like a hotshot. All they do is just stand all day long and open the door for you. Receptionists and some assistants too, their job exists not to serve society but simply to signal status or privilege or prestige. Goons are aggressive or manipulative positions that exist mainly to harm, compete, or manipulate others. So these can include lobbyists, PR specialists, telemarketers, corporate lawyers, whose work is mainly to tie up competition. And here too, their purpose is not socially productive, it's to gain advantage, often by exploiting or obstructing others. Then you have the duct tapers. These are not actual people who duct tape, who put duct tape on stuff. They're here to fix problems that shouldn't exist in the first place, or patch over inefficiencies or failures in an organization. For example, IT support dealing with a broken system, or managers who only resolve conflicts caused by poor planning. So their job only exists because of avoidable errors or flawed systems, not because it's inherently necessary. Then you have the box tickers. These perform tasks mainly to allow the organization to claim that it is doing something, often for compliance or appearances, like compliance officers in companies with no real enforcement, HR people doing paperwork that nobody reads. Like the work exists mainly to fulfill bureaucratic checklists. And then you have the task masters. So these, they manage or supervise others unnecessarily, sometimes creating work that wouldn't exist without them. For example, middle managers who exist only to oversee other managers or employees, or project managers for projects that don't really matter. And you can easily recognize a bullshit job because even those who have these jobs know its nature. You know it's a bullshit job when you feel like society would hardly be affected if that job stopped existing entirely. That's, by the way, the final definition Graeber gives of a bullshit job in chapter 1. A bullshit job is a form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though as part of the conditions of employment in his contract, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case, that his job, has a point. And Saito and Graeber, they argue that today the world is flooded with bullshit jobs, with meaningless works. Most jobs are bullshit jobs. Most of our work is work that will have no substantial impact on society if that work disappears. But capitalism makes them necessary in order to be able to survive in a capitalist society. This can be done by making them highly appealing through, high revenues. Like we all feel that a capitalist society is very unstable for the future, that you always need to make a lot of money to be able to sleep at night without anxiety. So for survival, you always need to aim at the highest paid jobs. But by doing so, you end up devaluating essential work because the high-paying jobs, well, all the tasks that they give you are meaningless and pointless. So you pay a lot of money, someone to do a task that has no use value, while those working in the care industries like school teachers, those who choose a socially important and high-minded vocation, get low pay and stressful conditions. As Saito says, and indeed, We all seem to be endlessly attending useless meetings, preparing materials for presentations that no one cares about, writing business PR articles to post on Facebook that no one will read, and touching up pictures in Photoshop that will be appreciated by no one. This contradiction is characteristic of a present moment in which people are flocking to industries that pay well but produce almost no use value. Essential work, on the other hand, is low-paying and chronically plagued by worker shortages. Now, one thing I'd like to point is that there is a whole range of bullshit jobs in terms of pay. There are bullshit jobs with low pay, because there's this idea that bullshit jobs pay a lot, but there are actually many bullshit jobs that don't pay a lot because they are jobs invented literally just so that you can get just get by, just to lower rates of unemployment. Like the government plays a role in this, in the creation of these jobs, and Graeber discusses this in chapter 5 about why these jobs are everywhere. If a category of jobs is proliferating, you can guess that it cannot be exclusively high-paying jobs. To go back to the example of apples, for example, it's like you create a job entirely for someone to just put duct tape on a plastic bag of apples. That's his entire job, so that he can, get a small salary just to buy, the apples that he needs to eat. And so obviously this won't be a high-paying job. Graeber even says in that chapter that these jobs can be found easily in nations where the government was like, I'm going to make full employment a reality. Except that when you think of work as just a matter of employment, we already mentioned this, when you look at work as just matter of employment, you will create bullshit jobs. And this was the case in the Soviet Union and Maoist China, for example. You had extremely low rates of unemployment, but that doesn't mean that people's lives were all decent and all their jobs were meaningful. Now, of course, you won't find policies that straight up admit that they are making bullshit or pointless jobs just to lower rates of unemployment. Policies don't need to, actually. As Graeber says, like these policies, they speak for themselves, so they don't need to tell you that this is a bullshit job. So the point is, while bullshit jobs may have a range in terms of pay, essential work doesn't in capitalism. There is constant pressure on essential work by making its conditions just unbearable. So even if essential work is still practiced, capitalism takes away everything valuable from it, so that so that those performing it end up hating it. When Marx says making work attractive, he means making essential work attractive again. Transitioning to a society that prioritizes use value means a society that necessarily places a high value on essential work. So this, of course, cannot be a market-driven society. We cannot let the market decide on what activity is valuable, because the market's criteria of value, it's just antagonistic with humans' criteria. Markets only value, while humans value what satisfies their needs, meaning use value. So by getting rid of all bullshit jobs, we will slow down the economy because these are extra jobs. Every bullshit job is an unnecessary activity, meaning an unnecessary burden on the planet. So prioritizing use value means reducing unnecessary activity, but it doesn't mean increasing necessary activity, or at least increasing it to the point where it produces the same burden on the environment. If your activities are destroying the environment, you have by and large certainly exceeded necessary work. You are no longer prioritizing use value if you have a number of activities that are causing a metabolic rift, even if taken individually, each one of those activities is essential work or has use value. So with less bullshit jobs, with slowing down the economy, you have great environmental benefits. So not only you benefit society, but also the planet. And essential work like care work is not only important socially, but it also results in few carbon emissions and uses few resources. So as Saito says, once we abandon our desire to constantly grow the economy, we can abandon our patriarchal fixation on manufacturing as well, and head down the path of reevaluating labor-intensive industries like care work. Such a transition will lead to a style of work appropriate to an age of lowering the energy return on energy invested. This too will cause deceleration. After all, it's impossible to raise the productivity of care work without lowering its quality. Now, Graeber spends a big chunk of the book talking about the caring classes. So these are the social classes of care workers. They're like the proletariat, but instead of having nothing but their physical labor to sell, they sell their emotional labor. Saito too focuses on them. The prime example of essential work that we've been reading about this far is care work. According to Saito, to focus on care work, to make his point for degrowth communism, it's not just because it's an industry that's kind to the environment. It's also because people engaged in care work have risen up to resist the logic of capitalism all over the world. This is what Graeber has called the revolt of the caring classes. So he introduced that notion in chapter 6 of Bullshit Jobs, section concerning the inverse relationship between the social value of work and the amount of money one is likely to be paid for. So it's about the contrast between the value of your work in terms of use value, in terms of its utility for society, and the paycheck. Bullshit jobs are basically jobs that add no social value, they are of no use to society, and yet they are highly paid, while jobs that serve social value, that make people's lives better, are underpaid. So the caring classes are those who work jobs that have high social values, but they can barely make ends meet. He describes it like this. I wanted to do something useful in my life, for example, work that had a positive effect on other people or at the very least wasn't hurting anyone. But the way this economy works, if you spend your working life caring for others, you will end up so underpaid and so deeply in debt you won't be able to care for your own family. Now, the caring classes are present in revolutionary talk because they can present a revolutionary power because they're as, if not more, exploited than the proletariat. Now, those whose essential work is primarily physical. Physical essential work isn't considered a calling as much as emotional essential work. It doesn't make sense for physical labor to be always on duty, for example, always ready to receive a call to perform work. Workers in a factory never face an emergency call where they have to rush back to the factory at any moment. And that's because their labor, while essential, is essential for society as a whole, not for specific individuals. What you produce physically is made to be consumed and used openly for and by others. And that's why physical work, essential work, can be more vulnerable to standardization. But if in care work, if you are a nurse or a therapist, if your work is helpful in a more direct way, where your work is more, oriented towards specific individuals that you have to work with and you help them, and you never know when someone might need you, so you are always on call, always on duty. And so these tasks completely resist the logic of capitalism. We feel more the impact on the quality of the work when it is care work that we try to standardize than physical work. Care work must never be standardized, but the point of standardizing work can also paradoxically, since this is capitalism, reduce the hours of work. You can reduce physical labor's time through standardization and use machinery without taking away its use value. Standardization can be compatible with essential work as long as it doesn't try to use standardization to raise productivity to lower costs in order to make profits. it's not to increase value, but use value. If this is, its goal of standardization, then standardization is good here. It's actually very helpful. If it's to increase value, then the standardization won't reduce working hours. It will just, make the worker work longer hours to produce way more, but this is an additional step. In physical labor, long hours are not inherent to labor. Depending on the technology and the tools you use to assist you in the process, you can have shorter hours. So with essential work that is physical, long hours aren't really a necessity. It's just capitalism that makes them a necessity to make sure that no time that can be used to increase value is wasted. But with care work, you always need to work long hours precisely because you cannot standardize the process. You need to take your time with your patients, for example, listen to them very carefully, tend to them, etc. So from the start, this is work that is high cost, it takes time, and it is helpful. This is what makes it more of a calling than a job. You feel that it demands sacrifices, sacrifices not in the Adam Smith sense, but let's say sacrifices that are morally necessary because they involve direct help. And as such, care work's use value is incredibly high. Use values don't work like exchange values. For an exchange value to be high, its cost must be very low in terms of value, because socially speaking, the cost of exchange value are extremely high. They are not low for those profiting from it. Use value, however, is high when its cost is high. When you know that this has use value, it means that you know that this has benefits for others as well. Quality enters in the picture here. The quality of use value is about the quality of people's lives once that use value had an impact on those lives. With use value, you have a responsibility of providing good quality because what has use value is for everyone. With care work, you are in that position. What you are going to deliver is going to have a significant impact on others. So you cannot fuck up. You need to be very careful with it, and thus you cannot take risks. You need to provide top quality. And so this, however, is incompatible with the mentality of low costs, because you will probably deliver a poor quality service if you try to increase your productivity, if you try to lower costs. It's okay to do it when the service has no substantial impact on people's lives, but when your entire economy wants to make things at a cheap cost, it's going to have a bad impact on both society and the environment, and even more so when you also want to do that with things that inherently make substantial impact on people's lives, things with high use value. But that's what capitalism wants, and this makes care work its perfect target. You have workers here ready to work for long hours and are more motivated by the fact that the work is helpful, that it is useful, and not because of money. And they see it as a calling. This is the perfect recipe for making profit on the one hand, and on the second hand, this is the perfect target of capitalism. Because it is so useful, there's here, a danger for capitalism, because when it sees people engaging in useful activities driven by the fact that it is useful, not because they are after money, it means that these people believe in mutual aid, in communal self-sufficiency, and free access to what is useful. So basically, this is a commons. And capitalism, like we said, and saw many times, it cannot let this pass. It cannot tolerate the existence of commons. So it has to destroy this organization by privatizing it and lobbying governments to cut taxes so that public funds don't reach them, which lead to cost cuts, which leads to a worsening in the services that they offer. And they restrict the influence of such organization by exploiting the workers too, making them powerless by rendering their living and working conditions unbearable through low pay and underfunding. And also they make sure that the workers are always supervised, checked, controlled, monitored, etc., so that the principles of mutual aid, free access, and self-sufficiency don't spread. And so this way you get almost free labor, long hours, and conditions that even make the people doing these jobs fed up with them. That way you even sever the social link that could have existed between them and their patients or care receivers, to the point where neither sees the work as help, to the point where we don't even recognize the use value anymore, and thereby discouraging people to pursue careers in these jobs. So, staff in care work are always overworked, underpaid, and always understaffed, even destroying any positive self-image that they could have had about themselves. Capitalism then wins. Essential workers, like care workers, are currently forced to work long hours for low wages precisely because their work is helpful and considered to be a calling. Indeed, it's the fact that it is a calling that is being exploited. Furthermore, they are often held in contempt by administrators who create needless levels of supervision and regulation without actually helping anyone at all. So, those 2 points are just these are the 2 points that we just explored. Now, exploit the fact that it is a calling and keep tight control through the task masters and box tickers. So in short, no use value is allowed. But eventually, as Saito and Graeber pointed, these caring classes are fed up with how bad, their working conditions have become. They don't put up with it anymore, and they started to revolt and protest. Saito gives the examples of protest in Japan, including a mass resignation of childcare workers, formal objections filed from the sites of medical care, teacher strikes, nursing strikes, work stoppages at 24/7 convenience stores, and strikes among workers at expressway service areas. All of them gaining support from the general public on social media. So the reference here, however, is from a Japanese writer, so I couldn't read it. I only have Saito's summary, and his most important point, he argues that these movements need greater global support. When they happen, we need to make a choice. Either we join and support these movements, which will mean that we took a stand against an economy run by bullshit jobs and increase value, or ignore them and decide to continue denigrating use value, which means choosing capitalism and the death of society and also the planet. In other words, we have a choice between strengthening mutual aid and deepening the divisions between us. If you pick the right path to follow, it could lead to the creation of a new society, a remade community founded on democratic forms of mutual aid. So, like I said, care work is modeled on the management of the commons, and therefore it means that the revolt of the caring classes isn't just a transitionary form of resistance, but something more. These revolts aren't just resisting capitalism. Now, the principles that carry them, the principles of care work, aim at actually transcending capitalism, to overthrow it and replace it with something else. It's not just resisting it. So it wants to replace it with the implementation of forms of self-management. If care work is so devalued in capitalism, it's because, like I said, it represents a form of communal self-sufficiency. People just care for one another. Their social relations are based on mutual aid rather than commodity exchange. So this form of social organization can only be autonomous, meaning, self-sufficient and thereby self-managed. So the irresponsible management of schools, hospitals, nursing homes, etc., all of that, we've seen its consequences as raw as possible, possibly can during the pandemic. So care sectors such as nursing, teaching, and caregiving cannot work with neoliberal principles, which is well known by capitalists. It's no secret that austerity measures result in low salaries, long working hours, and chronic shortages of workers, as well as the deterioration of facilities. The consequences of these measures were expected during the pandemic, and it wasn't a mistake from our political leaders and political capitalist CEOs. They knew that the cuts that they were doing in care work will lead to this because they don't want care work to actually work. They need it not to. So they don't want those sectors to work, because if they work, then it means that capitalism is beaten. If they work, then we don't need bureaucratic management or any bullshit job to supervise and vampirize on public funds. And so that's why when protests emerged from the care work sectors, the protesters didn't just ask for higher wages. Their demands were more radical than that. They were, bargaining for the common good. Even though they weren't communists, and in this situation, what is needed isn't bargaining but demanding a system change entirely, they still see how this system is irrational. Quote, teachers not only demand high wages, but also higher quality education, including a cap on the number of students per teacher. More special education, more bilingual education, a nurse and librarian in every school, and protection from students protection for students from immigration enforcement authorities. During the strikes, schools offered packed lunches to children eligible for free school meals, and free parents took care of kids whose parents were at work. Public servants working in the welfare sector, such as nurses and caregivers, are also striking for higher wages and more staff, as well as for more hospital beds in the national healthcare budget. In January 2023, more than 7,000 nurses in New York went on a 3-day strike to protest the fact that there were too few nurses. Short-staffed hospitals are not just bad in terms of working conditions, stress and burnout. Crowded conditions put patients at risk as well. In attempting self-management, the workers were clearly rejecting the exploitation and degradation of their calling by neoliberal reforms. So for the capitalists, the negative consequences that these workers are fighting are not irrational, since it is perfectly aligned with his goal, which is increased value. But for those who value human life and dignity for themselves and others, for the care workers and the patients, the school children, etc., this is irrationality in its peak. So these demands are clearly incompatible with the capitalist incentive that production decisions should remain in the hands of capitalists. What the teachers and nurses are demanding here is that they must get control over the production process as well. The essential work of care workers requires that we don't waste resources over activities and products that have almost zero use value. Hence, they demand a transfer of power back to the workers themselves. And as long as it is capitalists who decide on what to do with resources and production, essential work will always be suffering from this pressure, which is, just suicide from a social perspective. So accepting these demands means that capitalists' control over resources diminishes and private riches go down, and therefore public wealth goes up. So this is the return of the commons, of mutual aid, of self-management, of cooperation and solidarity. A great example of why care work creates solidarity and cooperation is that both producers and consumers are mutually engaged in the labor process. For example, child care workers, labor, and their parents and patients and the consumers, they need to work in solidarity. Giving care also requires work from the one who receives it. The receiver, too, is expected to communicate, to help and guide the caregiver. Like in therapy, both therapist and patient are actually working together rather than having one who produces and the other who passively consumes. So here again, this solidarity opens up the possibility of a more stable cooperative form of self-management. It's everyone who is involved in the production process from its beginning to its end, to consumption and beyond, who participate in it. This is yet another live example of how you break the division of labor between conception and execution, and why the revolt of care work is, in Saito's word, an active revolt that returned production to the hands of workers while maintaining the quality of the service they produced. Alright, so those were the 5 pillars of degrowth communism: transition to use value-based economy, shortening working hours, abolition of division of labor, democratization of the labor process, and priority to essential work. We've seen also how, despite also being, pillars in traditional Marxism, because they omit the metabolic interaction with nature, they circle back to productivism and economic growth, which is incompatible with the pillars themselves. So these pillars then only makes sense in communism and in degrowth, which in reality are one and the same thing. You cannot have communism without degrowth, and you cannot have degrowth without communism, so degrowth communism. So these 5 pillars are then the foundation of Marx's late thought. At first he believed that capitalism is good since it unleashes the productive forces of the proletariat, but that means that to get to an economy based on use value, you need an economy based on exchange value. But late Marx broke with this argument and argued that a shift in production to emphasize use value must happen from the beginning. If it didn't, we cannot wait for capitalism to unleash more productive power, because on its own, a production based on commodity value will never make the shift to use value. Yes, it is a system full of contradictions, but the transcendence of this contradiction cannot come from the system itself. So it is if it is left on its own, its contradiction will simply turn the planet into an uninhabitable desert preceded by barbarism. So the shift must come from outside capitalism by doing the opposite of what capitalism wants to do. We must, reduce both production association with the creation of surplus value and the work hours that go to such production. In other words, what we must do isn't more productivity, but less of it. In short, we need to abolish everything that accelerates production and productivity. We have to abolish long work hours, but also the division of labor that robs workers of their creativity and thereby utilizing technology for its true purpose. And while we abolish that, unleashes productive forces in the productivist sense, we also need to increase the democratization of the labor process. We give workers back the power to make decisions about production democratically, and democratic decisions, like we saw, cannot be pressured by market demands or by growth. A democratic the decision-making process by its own nature takes more time, and thereby activities will slow down. Growth, however, cannot wait for that long, so to make the labor process democratic, you have to give up on economic growth. So this is a traditional. This is what the traditional Marxists didn't get, and so it ended with a state bureaucracy calling the shot, and it's also an ecological disaster. Last, Marx, at the end of his life, he calls for a sharp increase in the social value assigned to essential work, and that's needed by society, and especially low environmental impact. Essential work is like, democratic decision-making, by its very nature being centered towards needs. Its environmental costs are incredibly low. So, slowing down the economy is a necessity. Like we said, capitalism and our competitive way of life has made us used to the idea that deceleration is always bad, but we need to start trusting reason and not the cultural ethos in which we have been brought up. So capitalism tells us that our imperial mode of living is a positive thing, that growth and acceleration are good things, and yet all we had to do is just look at the word to be skeptical about this. We can easily verify that capitalism, with its demands for unlimited maximization of profits and economic growth, that is fundamentally, unable to protect the Earth's environment, and it is actually the one causing its destruction. How can we think that the destruction of the Earth's environment is a positive thing, especially when the environment is precisely what can allow us to enjoy good lives and positive lives? So we can easily, just by everyday experience, we can easily see that both humanity and nature are reduced to objects of exploitation under capitalism, and that it produces artificial scarcity that translates into poverty and destitution for the large part of humanity. Even if we are skeptical about communism because of the years of propaganda, it's obvious that we cannot consider capitalism a positive thing. Clearly, capitalism isn't our friend, and it seeks not to satisfy our needs, whether individual or social. By contrast, Saito says, the society brought about by the decelerated economy of degrowth communism will be, by contrast, one equipped to satisfy people's needs while also expanding the capacity for society to address environmental issues. By democratizing and decelerating production, we can heal the rift in the metabolic interaction between humans and nature. Alright, so what we need to combat climate change is first to name it appropriately. We need to understand climate change as a metabolic rift in the metabolic interaction between man and nature. Marx has shown that the rift is caused by economic growth that is always predicated on capitalist principles, and that's why the communist regimes of the 20th century were rightly called state capitalism. So, because economic growth is and will always be the root cause of the metabolic rift, and because there can be no capitalism without economic growth or economic growth without capitalism, what we need to do is to give up on growth altogether. To heal the metabolic rift, we need degrowth. But like we said, the point of healing this rift is so that humans enjoy a good and fulfilling life. So when we see when we say healing the metabolic rift, instead of just combating climate change, we mean establishing a relation between humans and nature that is sustainable and will allow humans to lead flourishing lives. Where, you know, they get to develop their faculties and abilities and their potential. So we are talking about a positive form of governance, one that can only make sense as a comprehensive project that includes the public management of water and power, the expansion of social ownership, the prioritization of essential work, the reorganization of agriculture, and so on. In short, you know, we need communism. So this project is carried by instances of resistance, like, you know, the rise of workers' co-ops or the revolt of the working classes, but these may seem quite small. But that's because they are often isolated. What we need is for those instances that are, you know, happening all over the world to come together and spread until they become a coordinated wave. We will see in the conclusion what is required for these instances of resistance to become a wave of capable of tackling and overthrowing capitalism. But for now, let's just appreciate these moments and their rise in frequency. In cities all over the world that have been impoverished by global capitalism, a groundswell is rising. Every day people are searching for a new kind of economy that will address their suffering. These movements are occurring in cities in every region of the planet, gathering the power to change politics even at the national level. These resistance movements are certainly not all calling for degrowth, and neither are they consciously arguing for communism, but movements that hold within them seeds with the potential to grow into degrowth communism are spreading more and more. This is because in the age of climate crisis, known as the Anthropocene, any movement facing the great divergence of capitalism by envisioning a new society completely different from our current one will inevitably move in this direction. Alright, so we get to the last section of this 7th chapter, which is about living well. Like we said, the point of degrowth communism, of healing the metabolic rift, is having good human lives. All of these movements, what they have at their core is the concept of Buen vivir. It means to live well. It originated from the indigenous peoples of Ecuador, and in their original language it's Sumakausei or Sumakausei. It's spelled Sumak, S-U-M-A-K, and Kausei, K-A-W-S-A-Y. I think, and I mean that's how it is pronounced and spelled, I think. And it was translated into Spanish and adopted in 2008 during the Ecuador's revision of the constitution to describe the state's obligation to guarantee citizens' right to buen vivir, or to a good life. So, a little bit of context. So Ecuador is a Latin American country between Colombia and Peru. We mentioned it briefly when we discussed the Guano War in the first chapter. So in the decades preceding 2008, Ecuador experienced some, chronic political turbulence marked by weak institutions and frequent presidential turnovers. Between 1996 and 2006, 5 presidents were either removed or forced to resign, and this instability was compounded by economic crisis, most notably the 2000 banking collapse, which wiped out citizens' savings and exacerbating inequality. And it was the usual shock doctrine to smuggle in neoliberal economic models promoted by the International Monetary Fund, which only made the situation worse. Plus, these measures were particularly heavy on indigenous communities. So indigenous and the social movements, particularly the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, they had increasingly mobilized to demand recognition of their land rights, their recognition of environmental protections, and political power, representation, and recognition of indigenous voices in national decision-making. In 2006, the election of a new president, Rafael Correa, on a platform advocating post-neoliberal, participatory governance and social justice, anti-corruption. This campaign promised to rewrite the constitution to address inequality, environmental protection, and democratic deficits. And so this election gave momentum to a constitution, to first a constituent assembly involving social movements, indigenous representatives, and civic society actors. And this assembly, along with the activism, resulted in the adoption of the 2008 new constitution of Ecuador. And this 2008 constitution, adopted under Correa's leadership, was revolutionary in both its content and also its philosophy. One of its most notable innovations was the recognition of nature, Pachamama, I think that's it is pronounced, or Pachamama. So anyway, that's the word for nature in the indigenous language. So it is the recognition of nature as a legal subject. And so in the Constitution, Article 71 to 74, it granted ecosystems rights to exist, to regenerate and to maintain their vital cycles, establishing a legal framework for environmental protection unparalleled in the global constitutions. And very importantly, strategic sectors such as oil, mining, and energy were placed under strengthened state oversight, intended to serve, social objectives and prevent exploitative practices. So this is very important for what I'm going to say next, because unless you didn't know, a few months ago, things got heated in Ecuador. So Ecuador's main source of energy is fossil fuel, but the Ecuadorian government has for decades before 2008 subsidized fossil fuels, especially gasoline and diesel. So it subsidized them to make them more affordable for citizens, for farmers, and transport sectors. So this means that if the true market price of diesel is, say, $1.50 per liter, the government sells it at perhaps $1 and pays the difference to oil companies. So the goal was to keep transport and food prices low, since much of Ecuador's economy depends on trucks, buses, and agricultural machinery that runs on diesel. But the subsidy is hugely expensive. It costs Ecuador billions of dollars annually. So the IMF and government reformers often argue that it drains public funds and benefits the rich more than the poor, since wealthier people consume more fuel and encourages smuggling of cheap fuel into neighboring countries. But this can, create a tension with the constitution, right? Because fuel subsidies, including diesel, are bad for the climate because they make fossil fuels artificially cheap, encouraging overconsumption and high carbon emissions and delaying energy transition. So the tension is that Ecuador depends heavily on oil exports and fossil fuel revenues to fund social programs and for its population to afford necessary goods, and yet its constitution explicitly protects nature and demands ecological balance. So Ecuador finds itself in a dilemma. If it cuts the subsidy, this can be good for the environment, but it hits poor and rural populations hardest because transport costs will rise, food prices will follow, and small farmers and bus drivers will lose income. But as we've seen through this book, things are more complicated than that. And some critics argue that the subsidies actually keep emissions lower than what they would be if those subsidies were removed. So what the government is supposed to do is make the transition to renewable energy, and keeping the subsidies will help the transition if the government is serious about the transition. So if you just remove the subsidies without having already invested in renewable energy and clean transportation, in accessible public transit for rural and urban population, and support for farmers to switch to sustainable machinery and practices, well, you will make things worse for the environment. So the removal of the subsidies will hit the poor and indigenous communities economically, which will result in further exclusion from political power. And without those communities, their representation and voice will diminish. So what you will have to count on for the energy transition is the voices of people that are not part of the indigenous communities. Can you really trust them with environmental issues, especially when removing the subsidies means that fuel will be sold at its market price? And just because it is cheaper doesn't mean it is not neoliberalism, people. And unless you think this is a case where neoliberalism is actually good for the environment, well, there's nothing we can do for you. But back in September and October 2025, that's exactly what happened. President Daniel Noboa, his government, eliminated the diesel subsidy as part of an IMF-backed reform plan to reduce the fiscal deficit. And so this immediately caused a sharp rise in diesel prices by up to 40 to 50% in some areas. And the result was mass protests, especially by indigenous groups, farmers, and transport unions, who say that they weren't consulted, so they were left out of the decision-making, which is very suspicious, and they cannot afford the increase. So anyways, to go back to the constitutional principle that these reforms have crushed, there are the principles of respecting nature and the principle of Buen vivir, emphasizing collective well-being, ecological balance, and social equity rather than mere economic growth. So these two principles, they go hand in hand. They want to align state policy with the needs of marginalized communities, indigenous populations, and the natural environment. So concretely, the principle of Buen vivir implies that the Constitution supposedly expanded participatory governance, granting citizens, especially historically excluded groups, meaningful channels for consultation and decision-making. In essence, the 2008 Constitution articulated a vision of Ecuador as an eco-social state, one that sought to reconcile human development with ecological integrity and social justice. It represented a deliberate departure from extractivist, market-driven models, and soon the phrase Buen vivir spread across South America. And it is now being used by leftists all over the world. And here, Saito says something interesting to which we will come back in the next chapter, learning from indigenous peoples. Traditionally, the values that carry economic growth, and vice versa, are based on the idea that nothing can be learned from non-European peoples. The Western ideal of civilization considers all other way of life as backward and uncivilized. But seeing that the West turned the world, what the West turned the world into, in terms of social and climate justice, worldwide movements began to revise the capitalist value systems and rejected the Western ideals of economic growth. So remember that promoting such ideals comes necessarily with elitism, productivism, and progressive views of history. You cannot have economic growth democratically. It can only be imposed by an all-powerful authority, whether the state or capital. And as such, this sort of economy requires that the silencing of many voices by discrediting them and rendering their knowledge illegitimate. But while we can criticize knowledge based on superstition and cultural traditions on epistemological grounds, we also need to pay attention to their political and ecological contribution as well. We can say many things about the knowledge of indigenous people all over the world. The fact remains that their political organizations were more egalitarian and more respectful of metabolic interactions with nature, and thereby their communal principles were more democratic than the principles that shaped Western democracies. If anything, it's often indigenous people who are often more sensitive to ecology and nature. Things only start to deteriorate deteriorate, ecologically speaking, when natives and indigenous voices are silenced or excluded from political matters and from production processes. So such instances of cooperation with indigenous populations are given by Saito, like the Standing Rock protests in the US. It's also known as the No DAPL movement. This was a series of grassroots demonstrations that took place from April 2016 to February 2017 in North Dakota, USA. So these protests were led primarily by the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and supported by numerous indigenous groups, environmental activists and allies, and the central issue was the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the DAPL. It's a 1,172-mile oil pipeline intended to transport crude oil from the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota to Illinois. And so the pipeline was planned to cross beneath the Missouri River, which serves as the primary water source for the tribe. And the risk of an oil split posed a significant threat to their water supply and the environment. Plus, the proposed route passed near sacred sites and burial grounds, leading to concerns about the destruction of culturally significant lands. So the tribe argued that the pipeline violated their right and posed environmental risks, highlighting broader issues of environmental justice for indigenous communities. And they also filed lawsuits against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, alleging violations of environmental laws and failure to adequately consult the tribe. Now, that protest didn't go through. Authorities employed military tactics to disperse protesters, leading to numerous injuries and over 700 arrests. And so the protest officially ended in February 2017, when law enforcement cleared the remaining camps and the pipeline was completed the same year. And so it now transports roughly 40% of the oil produced in North Dakota's Bacon region. And fun fact, that asshole pipeline company is now suing Greenpeace $667 million in damages that the environmental group caused, according to the company, during the construction of the pipeline. So anyways, the point is, despite the completion of the pipeline, the Standing Rock protest had a lasting impact, since it led to increased scrutiny of pipeline projects and greater awareness of indigenous rights and environmental issues. So the protest sparked a resurgence in indigenous activism and solidarity, with many tribes and communities strengthening their advocacy for land and water rights, and even solidarity worldwide, since the hashtag #NoDAPL became a rallying cry for environmental and social justice movements worldwide. So Saito quotes from the journalist Naomi Klein, who took part in the protest. The quote is from her book On Fire. He says, "I want to draw particular attention to her statement made during that time that we must have the humility to learn from indigenous teachings about the duties to future generations and the interconnection of all life. Subsequently, she has begun to adopt a position calling for degrowth." So that's from the chapter Capitalism Killed Our Climate Momentum, towards the end of the chapter, when she criticizes also socialism's ecological shortcomings. She says that socialism too has to acknowledge its environmental disasters, and socialism isn't necessarily ecological, so we need a new form of democratic eco-socialism. The example she uses for a socialism that is not ecological is Venezuela. Hugo Chavez and Maduro, they relied heavily on oil exports to support extensive welfare programs, which put a heavy toll on the environment. And instead she argued that we need the kind of eco-socialism that's based on values and practices often shared by indigenous people, especially their care and concern for future generation and the interconnection of all life. So that interconnection of all life has to be understood as the metabolic interactions of all life. So these interactions are expressed in the lifestyle of indigenous tribes, the ones whose teachings we have to take seriously. So the connection between ecological and environmental awareness and the good life is the takeaway here. To transition to a use value-based economy is to transition from the IMF to IMF measures, to Buen vivir. This good life, the lifestyle of happiness and freedom, is a lifestyle that is embedded in indigenous teachings of putting priority to ecology, to the respect of nature. And in other words, if you want to live well, start by respecting nature. To live well, you need a harmonious metabolic interaction with nature, and this starts by shifting our valuation criteria. What our cultures need to do and what the policies of our governments should put as the prime criteria for social success isn't the GDP, but indexes of happiness. So Saito also mentions the Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index, the GNH, as another example of learning from indigenous people how to live well. It's a developmental framework that measures the well-being of the population beyond purely economic metrics, like the GDP, and it was introduced by the king Jigme Singye Wangchuk in the 1970s. Bhutan is like Japan, it's a constitutional monarchy, so it has a king. So for those who don't know where it is, it's a landlocked country in South Asia, in the Himalayas, between China and India. So it's a very small country with just about 800,000 people, so yes, its population is less than 1 million. And so the GNH reflects Bhutan's belief that sustainable development should balance material growth with the spiritual, social, and environmental well-being. And so basically, true progress is not just economic growth, but also the happiness and quality of life of its citizens. So it integrates 4 pillars: the sustainable and equitable socio-economic development, like it improves living standards while reducing inequality, conservation of the environment to ensure ecological balance and long-term environmental health, the preservation and promotion of culture, maintaining Bhutanese cultural identity, traditions, and value, and lastly, good governance, which counts, transparency, accountability, and citizen participation in decision making. Now, I have to say that it is odd for Saito to mention the Bhutan Index in just one sentence and say nothing more about it, because I think that when you mention it, you have to also add a few more words of precaution, because that index can serve as propaganda to hide what the Bhutan government did in the 1980s and 90s, the 1990s, which is an ethnic cleansing. Bhutan is predominantly ethnically Ngalop and Sharshop. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce, these the different ethnicities there, but you have, in the north and central region, you have the, I'm gonna say Ngalop and Sharshop. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it right. And in the south, you have mostly Lhotshampa, which are descendants of Nepali migrants. Again, not sure for the pronunciation if I'm pronouncing it right. And in the 1980s, the Bhutanese government, under the order of the same king that introduces the index in 1972, it promoted a policy of one nation, one people, emphasizing the same cultural norms, languages, dress, and religion for everyone. And so this policy imposed Bhutanese language and cultural practices, particularly on the Lhotshampa, who were seen as culturally distinct, mostly Hindus, while the Bhutanese government was Buddhist and were politically marginalized. So starting in the 1980s and 1990s, the government expelled tens of thousands of Lhotshampa to Nepal and India. Estimates suggest that over 100,000 people were forced into refugee camps in Nepal, while some later resettled in countries like the US, Canada, and Australia. Those who remained in Bhutan often faced surveillance, harassment, and imprisonment, especially if they resisted assimilation policies. So we have to take this with a grain of salt. The philosophy of the index is often misunderstood by people in the West. They take it as, really promoting democratic ideals, like we have been arguing throughout the book, but it has another meaning for the Bhutanese. Careful there, Saito, not to fetishize indigenous or non-Western teachings too, but the fact remains that the Western value system, the IML, capitalism, and its tendency to shut down indigenous voices are at odds with democracy and ecology. So we do need to come up with alternative lifestyles, one that really expresses Buen vivir, its principles and practices, and such lifestyle cannot be found in the West. This is not, to reverse the trend. The trend is not to say there is nothing to learn from northern countries, as if no Buen vivir philosophies exist there, or we cannot learn from white indigenous populations. What it means to say is that alternative lifestyles to the imperial mode of living based on Buen vivir philosophy aren't only to be found in the global north. The question, how to live well, isn't a question that has experts or can be, the monopoly of a group of people. Every perspective here counts. Every choice, every voice needs to be heard and participate in this. And so the teaching is more in the sense of listening to the voices that the imperial mode of living has deliberately silenced, and therefore it resulted in the ecological crisis that we are dealing with today. So to quote Saito and end this episode, the current climate crisis is providing the impetus for the development of a new movement to discard Eurocentrism in favor of learning from the global South. This is the kind of development the late Marx himself wished for, and these seeds of communism have the potential, spurred by the deepening of the climate crisis, to become bolder and more vibrant until they bloom into an environmentalist revolution for the 21st century. In my final chapter, I will draw our attention to a few such seeds of change. So that's it for today. We finally finished this chapter. Next week we will start reading from the last chapter, the lever of climate justice. That's it. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and as always,